The map on the desk was largely a lie, or rather a hopeful fiction composed of rumors, ink, and the desperate geopolitical ambition of a young nation that had suddenly found itself doubling in size overnight. It was 1803, and the air in the private study of the President's house in Washington City was thick with humidity and the smell of old parchment. Thomas Jefferson, a man whose mind was a sprawling cabinet of curiosities ranging from mastodon bones to French philosophy, stared at the great blank space west of the Mississippi River. To the modern eye, looking back through the lens of satellites and paved interstates, it is almost impossible to conceive of the sheer, terrifying opacity of the North American continent at that time. It was not merely unknown, it was a void that swallowed imagination. There were theories, of course. Learned men in Philadelphia and London believed that the West was home to active volcanoes, mountains made of solid salt, and perhaps even living woolly mammoths grazing in lost valleys. But the most pervasive myth, the one that drove the pen across the check for $15 million to Napoleon Bonaparte for the Louisiana Territory, was the dream of the Northwest Passage. They believed in a symmetrical geography. They thought the Rocky Mountains, then called the Stony Mountains, would be no taller than the Appalachians in the east, a gentle ridge that a man could walk over in half a day, dragging a canoe, before sliding it into a great river that flowed effortlessly west to the Pacific Ocean. This was the dream of the water communication, a trade route that would unlock the wealth of the Indies. It was a beautiful, logical, and completely incorrect assumption. And to prove it, or rather to crash against the hard reality of it, Jefferson chose a man who was as complex and shadowed as the wilderness he was about to enter. Meriwether Lewis was 29 years old, a man of moody silences and rigid discipline, possessing a jagged intellect that seemed to catch on everything it touched. He was Jefferson's private secretary, a neighbor from Albemarle County, and a man who had grown up in the woods. But Lewis was not a simple frontiersman. He was a melancholy romantic, prone to deep bouts of depression that he called his constitutional gloom, yet capable of manic bursts of energy and obsessive preparation. For months, under Jefferson's tutelage, Lewis was not looking at trees or rivers. He was looking at books. He was sent to Philadelphia, the intellectual capital of the United States, to undergo a crash course in the sciences that would make a modern graduate student weep. He learned botany from Benjamin Smith Barton, mathematics and celestial navigation from Robert Patterson, anatomy from Caspar Wistar, and medicine from the famous Dr. Benjamin Rush. Rush, a man who believed in aggressive purgatives, handed Lewis a supply of potent laxatives known as Rush's Thunderbolts, pills composed of mercury and jalap that would leave a chemical trail across the continent, markers of the expedition's distress that archaeologists would find centuries later. Lewis was preparing to be a moving encyclopedia, a man who could categorize a new species of squirrel, set a broken bone, navigate by the stars, and conduct diplomacy with unknown empires, all while keeping 30 men alive in a landscape that wanted to kill them. But Lewis knew his own limitations. He knew that his dark moods could paralyze him, and he knew that the wilderness required a steadiness that he sometimes lacked. And so, in a move that violated the military protocol of the time and confused the bureaucrats in Washington, he reached out to a former commander, a man named William Clark. If Lewis was the brooding, brilliant mind of the expedition, Clark was its steady hand and beating heart. 4 years older than Lewis, Clark was a redhead, amiable, practical, and possessing a natural authority that did not require shouting. He was a master waterman, a skilled cartographer who could draw a map of a river bend by eye that matched modern satellite imagery with uncanny precision, and a man who understood the rough psychology of soldiers and frontiersmen. Lewis wrote to him, offering a co-command, a partnership of equals that the Army did not officially recognize, but which the two men honored with an absolute fidelity that remains one of the greatest friendships in history. Clark accepted immediately. He was bored with civilian life, debt-ridden, and hungry for the horizon. Together, they began to assemble the Corps of Discovery. They did not want gentlemen. They wanted young, unmarried men of robust constitution, good hunters, men used to the woods and the water. They recruited in the Ohio Valley, picking hard men who could shoot squirrels in the eye and endure cold rain for weeks. Among them were the 9 young men from Kentucky, the backbone of the crew, and others like George Drouillard, the half-Shawnee interpreter and hunter, whose skills would save the expedition from starvation time and again. There was York, Clark's enslaved manservant, a man of immense strength and agility, who had grown up with Clark, and who would become the first African-American to cross the continent, finding a strange and temporary kind of freedom and respect among the indigenous nations that the white society denied him. And there was Seaman, Lewis's Newfoundland dog, a massive black beast who would swim rivers, chase buffalo, and guard the campfires against the prowling terrors of the night. The preparation was a logistical epic in itself. Lewis oversaw the construction of a keelboat in Pittsburgh, a 55-foot-long vessel that was a hybrid of a galley and a barge. It had a sail, but for most of the journey it would be powered by the back-breaking labor of men poling against the current, rowing, or literally dragging the boat over sandbars with ropes made of elk hide. They bought tons of supplies, nearly 200 pounds of portable soup, a glue-like substance that the men would come to hate, rifles, powder, lead, flints, mathematical instruments, ink, paper, and gifts for the Indian tribes they would encounter, beads, mirrors, sewing needles, peace medals stamped with Jefferson's profile, and technological marvels like magnets and burning glasses. The winter of 1803 was spent at Camp Dubois on the Wood River, just across from the mouth of the Missouri. It was a time of drilling, shooting, and weeding out the weak. The men drank, fought, were court-martialed, and slowly forged into a unit. They watched the water of the Missouri River, the big muddy, churning past them. It was unlike any river they had ever seen. It was thick with silt, carrying whole trees that bobbed and wove like battering rams, shifting its channels overnight, a violent, unpredictable beast that they would have to fight mile by mile, upstream, all the way to the mountains. The locals in St. Louis, French fur traders who knew the lower river well, looked at this group of Americans with a mixture of pity and skepticism. They knew the Missouri, they knew the Sioux. They shook their heads and predicted that these men would never be seen again. On May 14, 1804, the day finally came. It was a rainy Monday afternoon. Clark wrote in his journal, with his characteristic creative spelling, "I set out at 4:00 p.m. in the presence of many of the neighboring inhabitants, and proceeded on under a gentle breeze up the Missouri." Lewis was not actually with them at that moment. He was in St. Louis finishing diplomatic business and would ride overland to join the boat a few days later in St. Charles. The beginning was unglamorous. They made only a few miles that first day. The keelboat was heavy and awkward. The river immediately began to test them. The current was relentless, tearing at the banks, collapsing tons of earth into the water with thunderous splashes that sounded like cannon fire. They were entering a tunnel of green, the dense hardwood forests of the lower Missouri closing in around them. For the first few weeks, the journey was a physical conditioning camp. The men's hands blistered and bled, then calloused over. Their shoulders ached from the poles. They ate salt pork and cornmeal, supplementing it with whatever game the hunters could bring in. They were moving through what is now the state of Missouri, a land of humid heat and clouds of mosquitoes that descended on them like smoke. Lewis, once he joined, began his scientific work. He walked along the banks, his eyes scanning for the new. He noted the size of the cottonwood trees, the behavior of the squirrels, the temperature of the water. Every night, no matter how exhausted, he and Clark would sit by the fire and write. They wrote down courses and distances, drawing maps, recording the events of the day. This act of writing was the mission's heartbeat. If they died, the journals had to survive. Without the journals, the journey was just a long walk. With them, it was the expansion of human knowledge. As they pushed north and west, the landscape began to change subtly. The trees thinned out. The air grew drier. They were approaching the Great Plains. But before the landscape opened up, they had to navigate the complex human geography of the river. The lower Missouri was not empty wilderness. It was a highway of nations. They met fur traders coming downriver, men with beards matted with grease, their canoes laden with beaver pelts, bringing news of the tribes upriver. And then they met the tribes themselves. The encounters were ritualistic. The keelboat would pull to shore. The captains would don their dress uniforms, heavy wool coats with gold braid, completely unsuited for the summer heat, and march out to meet the chiefs. There were speeches, translated through a chain of languages, English to French to an Indian language, and back again. Lewis would give his speech about the Great Father in Washington, a concept that must have seemed abstract and irrelevant to chiefs who ruled their own vast domains. They smoked the calamute, the sacred pipe, passing it around in a circle, the blue smoke binding them in a temporary truce. The early encounters were peaceful, but tense. The Otos and the Missouris were relatively friendly, but rumors of the Teton Sioux upriver cast a long shadow. The Sioux were the gatekeepers of the upper Missouri, a powerful expansionist empire that controlled the trade flow and demanded tribute from anyone passing through. By late summer, the heat was suffocating. The men were plagued with boils and dysentery. One man, Sergeant Charles Floyd, fell ill with a bilious colic. It was likely a burst appendix, a condition that even the best doctors in Philadelphia could not have treated in 1804. Floyd suffered in agony for days as the boat rocked slowly against the current. On August 20th, he died. He was the only member of the expedition to die on the entire journey, a remarkable statistic given the dangers they faced. They buried him on a high bluff overlooking the river, erecting a cedar post to mark the grave. It was a somber moment, a reminder of their mortality. They were now hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement, carrying a dead comrade's rifle and leaving his bones in the clay of a hill that would bear his name forever. The death of Floyd seemed to harden the resolve of the men. They were no longer just a collection of soldiers. They were a family bound by loss and the shared struggle against the river. They pressed on into the land of the Sioux. The encounter with the Teton Sioux in late September was the crisis point that nearly ended the expedition before it truly began. The Tetons were used to intimidating French traders into giving them guns and ammunition. They saw the American boat not as a diplomatic vessel, but as a toll booth. When Lewis and Clark met the chiefs, Black Buffalo and the Partisan, the tension was electric. The Americans offered medals and a few gifts, but the Sioux wanted more. They wanted the keelboat to stop. They grabbed the tow rope. Bows was strung. Clark, his hand on his sword, refused to back down. Lewis ordered the men on the boat to prepare their rifles. The swivel guns, small cannons mounted on the boat, were loaded and aimed. For a few terrifying minutes, a massacre hung in the balance. A single accidental shot would have unleashed a slaughter. The Americans were vastly outnumbered. They would have been wiped out, their bodies thrown into the river, and history would have been different. But Chief Black Buffalo, sensing the resolve of these strange men, or perhaps calculating that a fight would bring too many casualties, de-escalated the situation. He waved his men back. The rope was released. The expedition proceeded. But for days the Sioux followed them along the banks, a silent, menacing escort. The captains did not sleep. They kept the boat anchored in the middle of the river, guards posted, watching the fires of the Sioux villages, listening to the drums. It was a psychological gauntlet, and when they finally passed out of Teton territory, the relief was palpable. As autumn deepened, the wind began to bite. The green of the cottonwoods turned to gold, and the grasses of the high plains cured to a tawny brown. They were entering the country of the Mandan and Hidatsa, near present-day Bismarck, North Dakota. This was the hub of the Northern Plains trade network, a place where vast earth lodge villages housed thousands of people, more than lived in St. Louis or Washington at the time. These were not nomadic hunters living in teepees. They were farmers and traders living in permanent fortified cities surrounded by fields of corn, beans, and squash. The expedition decided to build their winter quarters here. They constructed a triangular fort of cottonwood logs, naming it Fort Mandan. The winter of 1804-1805 descended with a ferocity that the men from Kentucky and Virginia had never experienced. The temperature plunged to 40 degrees below zero. The river froze into a solid highway of ice. The air was so cold that it hurt to breathe, freezing the moisture in a man's nostrils instantly. At night, the timbers of the fort popped and cracked like gunshots in the frost. Inside the fort, life settled into a routine of survival and diplomacy. The blacksmiths set up a forge, and this became the expedition's greatest asset. The Mandan were fascinated by the bellows and the magical way the iron glowed. They brought corn and buffalo meat to trade for metal axes, and most eagerly for war hatchets that the smiths forged from old stove parts. It was during this frozen winter that a French-Canadian trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau arrived at the fort. He was a man of little distinction, often regarded by the captains as a bit of a fool and a coward, but he possessed something valuable, a wife. Her name was Sacagawea. She was a Shoshone girl, roughly 16 or 17 years old, who had been kidnapped by a raiding party of Hidatsa years earlier and sold to Charbonneau. She was heavily pregnant. Lewis and Clark, looking ahead to the mountains, knew they would need horses to cross the divide, and the Shoshone were known to have vast herds of horses. Sacagawea spoke Shoshone. She could be the key to the mountains. On February 11, 1805, inside a smoky, drafty lodge, Sacagawea went into labor. It was a difficult birth. Lewis, acting as the expedition's doctor, was anxious. He was told by a French trader that a small amount of the rattle of a rattlesnake, crushed and mixed with water, would hasten the birth. Whether it was the science of the rattlesnake or simply time, Sacagawea gave birth to a healthy boy, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, whom the captains would affectionately nickname Pump or Pumpy. The presence of this infant would prove to be a passport of peace for the expedition. War parties did not travel with women and babies. When suspicious tribes saw the young mother and her child, they knew the white men were not there to fight. As the sun began to linger longer in the sky, and the ice on the Missouri began to break up with terrifying groans and crashes, the Corps of Discovery prepared for the second, more dangerous leg of their journey. They were about to leave the known world entirely. Up to the Mandan villages there were maps, rough, inaccurate, but existent. Beyond this point, there was only blank paper. They packed up the keelboat and sent it back downriver to St. Louis with a skeleton crew, carrying the journals, the maps, and crates of specimens for Jefferson, including a living prairie dog and a magpie, which miraculously survived the journey to the White House. On April 7, 1805, the main party turned their faces west. They were now 33 people and 1 dog, in 6 small dugout canoes and 2 pirogues. Lewis wrote in his journal that day, expressing a rare moment of vulnerability and grandeur. "It is now upon us to penetrate a country at least 2,000 miles in width, on which the foot of civilized man had never trodden. The good or evil it had in store for us was for experiment yet to determine. I could but esteem this moment of my departure as among the most happy of my life." The river here was different. It was clearer, faster, running through a landscape that seemed to stretch into infinity. This was the high plains, a sea of grass that rippled in the wind like an ocean. And it was alive. The sheer biomass of the American West in 1805 is difficult to comprehend. They saw herds of buffalo that numbered in the tens of thousands, darkening the plains as far as the eye could see, the sound of their hooves a low, constant rumble in the earth. There were elk, antelope, wolves, and grizzly bears. The grizzly was a creature of myth to them, something they had heard of but underestimated. Lewis, with his scientific curiosity, was eager to encounter one. He felt that the Indians' fear of the bear was superstitious exaggeration. He would soon learn otherwise. The silence of the high plains was not a true silence, but a vast, breathing quietude composed of the wind hissing through the short grass, the distant dry rattle of cottonwood leaves, and the lowing of buffalo herds that were so immense they seemed like geological features rather than biological ones. As the Corps of Discovery moved west from Fort Mandan in the spring of 1805, they were entering a world where the scale of life and land dwarfed them completely. The river, the Missouri, was their only tether to the known world, a twisting, muscular snake of water that fought them every inch of the way. They were traveling against the grain of the continent, pushing upstream into the melting snowpack of mountains they had not yet seen. The labor was relentless. The men, now hardened into a singular organism of muscle and will, spent their days in a rhythm of grueling physical exertion that would have broken lesser men. They towed the heavy dugout canoes and the 2 pirogues, flat-bottomed boats that were wider and more stable, by walking along the muddy banks, ropes slung over their calloused shoulders, slipping in the clay, wading through freezing water that numbed their legs, and hacking through the thick willow brush that lined the shores. When the wind was right, they raised the sails, and the sudden relief of the wind doing the work was a luxury that felt like a divine gift. But the wind on the plains was capricious. It would roar out of the northwest with the force of a gale, driving sand into their eyes and food, sometimes blowing so hard that the boats were pinned against the bank, unable to move, while the men huddled under buffalo robes, waiting for the tantrums of the sky to pass. It was in this vast, open theater that the expedition finally met the white bear. The grizzly bear was a creature that the Indians had spoken of with a reverence that bordered on terror. They had told Lewis that they only hunted the bear in war parties of 6 or 10 men, and even then they expected to lose someone. Lewis, a man of the age of enlightenment, a man who believed in the superiority of the Kentucky long rifle and the discipline of modern ballistics, had been skeptical. He had written in his journal that he felt the Indians' fear was exaggerated, likely due to their inferior weaponry, bows and arrows, or cheap trade muskets. He would soon learn that a .54 caliber lead ball, while deadly to a deer or a man, was often just an annoyance to a 1,000-pound grizzly charged with adrenaline and rage. The first encounters were deceptively easy, but on April 29, 1805, the reality of the American monster made itself known. Lewis and a small party of hunters were on shore when they spotted 2 grizzlies. They fired. The bears, unlike the black bears of the East, which would turn and run at the sound of a twig snapping, did not flee. They charged. One bear, wounded, chased Lewis nearly 80 yards before he could reload. It took multiple shots to bring the beasts down. Lewis noted with a dawning respect that the creatures were incredibly tenacious of life. They could be shot through the lungs, even the heart, and still run for hundreds of yards with the speed of a racehorse, tearing up the ground and snapping jaws that could crush a man's skull like a melon. A few days later, the lesson was repeated with terrifying clarity. 6 of the expedition's best hunters, men who could shoot the eye out of a squirrel at 50 paces, spotted a massive grizzly lying on a bank. They crept up to within 40 yards. 4 of them fired simultaneously. All 4 balls hit the bear, 2 passing through its lungs. In a civilized world, the animal should have dropped. Instead, it rose with a roar that shook the air and launched itself at the men. The 2 hunters who had held their fire shot it again, breaking its shoulder. The bear didn't stop. It chased them down a steep bank and into the river. The men, panicked and unable to reload their muzzle-loading rifles in time, threw aside their guns and dove into the water. The bear plunged in after them, the water churning red around it. It was only when a final shot from shore struck the bear in the head that the chaos ended. They dragged the carcass to shore and butchered it, finding that 8 balls had passed through its body. Lewis, staring at the mountain of fur and muscle, revised his opinion. He wrote that he would rather fight 2 Indians than one of these white bears. From that point on, no man was allowed to walk alone on the shore. The wilderness had teeth, and it was watching them. But the bears were just one element of the psychological landscape they were traversing. The river itself was changing. The water was becoming clearer, losing the heavy silt of the lower Missouri. The landscape was shifting from the rolling green prairies to something more ancient and austere. They were entering what is now known as the Missouri Breaks in central Montana. The soft sandstone cliffs rose up from the water, sculpted with wind and rain into fantastic shapes that defied logic. Lewis, with his romantic soul, saw in these rocks the ruins of fallen empires. He described cliffs that looked like elegant cities with parapets, spires, and statuary. He saw white monuments that looked like polished marble, though they were merely soft white sandstone. It was a desolate, haunting beauty, a place where the silence felt heavy and watchful. The air was incredibly dry. The wooden stocks of their rifles shrank, the wood pulling away from the metal barrels. Their lips cracked and bled. The sun beat down with a clarity that was blinding, reflecting off the water and the white cliffs until their eyes ached. And yet, amidst this desolation, the wildlife was staggering. They passed herds of elk that numbered in thousands, their antlers like a moving forest. Wolves, bold and curious, followed the expedition along the banks, sometimes coming within feet of the campfires, their yellow eyes glowing in the dark. The animals here had never seen men, were at least not men like these, and they possessed a strange prelapsarian innocence. They did not run away immediately. They watched, they sniffed, they stood their ground until the wind carried the scent of gunpowder and sweat. On May 14, a disaster occurred that nearly wiped the expedition from the pages of history, not by the claws of a bear or the arrow of a warrior, but by a simple gust of wind and a moment of panic. The white pirogue, the boat carrying the expedition's most precious cargo, the journals, the scientific instruments, the medicines, and the trade goods, was under sail. Toussaint Charbonneau was at the helm. Charbonneau was, by all accounts, a terrible waterman. He was timid on the water and prone to freezing in a crisis. A sudden squall struck the boat, catching the sail and twisting the vessel. Instead of releasing the rope to let the sail flap loose or steering the boat into the wind to stabilize it, Charbonneau panicked. He turned the boat so that the wind hit the sail flat, driving the gunwale deep into the water. The boat tipped. Water poured in. The men on board yelled, but Charbonneau was paralyzed with fear, crying out to God. Pierre Creuset, a master boatman who was in the bow, shouted back at him, threatening to shoot him instantly if he didn't grab the rudder and do his job. The boat was on the verge of capsizing completely. If it had flipped, the heavy instruments would have sunk to the bottom of the Missouri, and the papers, the journals that contained the only record of their year of suffering and discovery, would have been washed away and destroyed. The expedition would have failed right there. In the midst of this chaos, while the men shouted and the boat teetered on the edge of ruin, it was Sacagawea who acted. She was sitting in the back of the boat, holding her baby, Pompey. As the water washed over the side, sweeping boxes and papers out of the boat, she did not scream. She leaned over the gunwale, calm and focused, and began scooping up the items that were floating away. She grabbed the journals, she grabbed the medicines, she grabbed the instruments. She caught them before the current could take them, piling them back into the wet boat while Charbonneau wept and Creuset steered. The boat was eventually righted and rowed to shore, half full of water. They spent the next few days drying out the papers and goods in the sun, losing very little of importance. Lewis, in his journal, gave rare praise to the young woman, noting her fortitude and quick thinking, acknowledging that she had saved the expedition's brain and memory. It was a moment that underscored the fragility of their enterprise. A single gust of wind, a moment of incompetence, could undo months of labor. It also highlighted the strange, quiet strength of the only woman among them, a teenager with an infant who seemed more at home in the chaos of the river than her husband. As they moved further west, the river began to twist and turn more violently. The men were exhausted. They were consuming enormous amounts of meat, up to 9 pounds of buffalo meat per man per day, just to fuel the calorie burn of poling the heavy boats against the current. They were essentially engines running on protein. But the diet lacked vegetables and fats, and the physical toll was visible on their bodies. Yet their morale remained surprisingly high. They were driven by the mystery of what lay ahead. They were looking for the great falls of the Missouri. The Indians had told them about the falls, a place where the river thundered and smoked. Lewis knew that finding the falls would be the confirmation that they were on the right path, that this was indeed the Missouri and not some other tributary leading them astray. But the river was deceptive. It split and forked. At one major junction, known as the Meriwether River Decision, the captains had to use all their geographical intuition to choose the correct fork. The men wanted to go one way. Lewis and Clark, analyzing the color and temperature of the water, insisted on the other. They were right. Their ability to read the water was becoming almost supernatural. On June 13, 1805, Lewis was scouting ahead of the main party, walking overland alone. He heard a sound in the distance. It was a dull roar, like the sound of a storm, but continuous. As he walked closer, the sound grew louder, a deep, vibrating bass note that seemed to come from the earth itself. He saw a column of mist rising into the blue sky, disappearing and reappearing like smoke. He He hurried his pace. He crested a hill, and there it was, the great falls of the Missouri. It was a sight of terrifying grandeur. The river, which had been their companion and adversary for thousands of miles, suddenly transformed into a chaotic fury, cascading over a precipice of rock 80 feet high. The water smashed onto the rocks below with such force that the spray created its own weather system, a perpetual rain that soaked the surrounding grass. Lewis was overwhelmed. He tried to sketch it. He tried to write about it, calling it the grandest sight he had ever beheld, but he felt his words were insufficient. But as he looked downstream, his awe turned to dread. It wasn't just one fall. As he walked further, he found another and another. There were 5 distinct cascades stretching over miles of river. The Indians had described a single fall. They had not mentioned a series of cataracts that would require a portage, a land crossing, of nearly 18 miles over rough, cactus-studded ground. The dream of the easy water passage died at the Great Falls. They could not simply drag the boats over a small ridge. They would have to unload tons of gear, build wagons from the trunks of cottonwood trees, and drag the heavy canoes overland for weeks. The terrain was brutal. It was covered in prickly pear cactus, sharp spines that pierced the men's moccasins and festered in their feet. The ground was hard and uneven. The sun was relentless, and the bears were everywhere. At the Great Falls, the grizzly bears were concentrated in numbers they had never seen, drawn by the buffalo carcasses that washed down the river over the falls. At night, the men slept with their rifles in their arms. The sleep story here becomes one of fitful rest, of listening to the roar of the water and the huffing breath of giant predators in the dark. Lewis, cut off from the main party for a night during his scouting, had a surreal experience that reads like a fever dream. After discovering the falls, he shot a buffalo for dinner. While he was waiting for it to die, a large bear crept up on him. His rifle was unloaded. He realized with a jolt of terror that he had forgotten the cardinal rule: never have an empty gun. The bear charged. Lewis ran. He ran into the river, waist deep, facing the bear with his espontoon, a spear-like officer's staff. The bear, for reasons known only to itself, stopped at the water's edge, looked at him, and then turned and walked away. Shaken, Lewis climbed out of the water and continued walking. Minutes later, he was charged by a strange creature, likely a wolverine or a cougar, which then disappeared. Then 3 buffalo bulls charged him. He wrote in his journal that it seemed the entire animal kingdom had conspired to kill him that day. He slept that night in the open, waking at every sound, the grandeur of the falls mixing with the primal fear of being a soft, slow biped in a land of fangs and claws. When the main party arrived, the reality of the portage set in. It was a month of agony. They built clumsy wagons with wheels made from cross-sections of cottonwood trunks. The wood was soft and brittle. The wheels cracked and broke. The axles screamed. The men harnessed themselves to the wagons, leaning into the ropes, dragging the heavy canoes and supplies through the dust and the cactus. The wind blew so hard that at times the men were physically blown over. But sometimes the wind helped. They would raise the sails on the canoes on land, and the wind would push the wagons through the grass, a surreal flotilla sailing across the dry prairie. The heat was oppressive, yet hailstorms would strike with sudden violence, pelting them with chunks of ice the size of apples, knocking men down and bruising them bloody. They were exhausted, battered, and constantly repairing their gear. Yet they did not stop. They were halfway to the Pacific, or so they thought. They were at the gates of the mountains, and the hardest part of the journey, they believed, was behind them. They were wrong. The mountains that lay ahead were not the gentle ridge of Jefferson's imagination. They were a fortress of rock and ice, a labyrinth that would test their sanity. During this month at the falls, amidst the labor, they celebrated the 4th of July, 1805. It was a strange celebration in the middle of the wilderness. They drank the last of their whiskey, the final drop of alcohol they would have for the rest of the journey. They danced to the tune of a fiddle played by Pierre Cruzat, their feet stomping the dust, laughing and singing under the vast Montana sky. It was a moment of human defiance and joy in a landscape that was indifferent to their existence. They were a tiny speck of light and noise in a continent of silence. With the whiskey gone, they were now sober men facing the Rockies. The portage was finally completed. They put their boats back into the water above the falls. But these were not the same boats. The heavy keel boat had been sent back. The large pirogues were hidden and left behind below the falls. They had built 2 new canoes from cottonwood trees, but Lewis had a grander plan. He had brought with him from the east a secret weapon, the iron boat. It was a frame of iron that could be assembled and covered with skins to make a lightweight vessel. He had carried it for thousands of miles. He assembled it now, covering it with elk skins and sealing it with a composition of charcoal, beeswax, and tallow. He launched it with pride. It floated beautifully for a few hours. Then the composition cracked and peeled. The boat leaked like a sieve. It was a failure. They had to sink it and hide the iron frame in the earth. It was a humiliating blow to Lewis's ingenuity. They were forced to make more traditional dugout canoes, hacking them out of the few available trees. On July 15, 1805, they loaded their new, smaller fleet and set off again, heading south and west, directly into the jaws of the Rocky Mountains. The river narrowed. The cliffs grew steeper. They were entering a place Lewis named the Gates of the Mountains. Here, the Missouri River seemed to be swallowed by the rocks. The cliffs rose vertically from the water for 1,000 feet, casting the river into perpetual shadow. It was a dark, cool, and ominous passage. The current was fast and deep. There was no place to land, no banks to walk on. They had to row hard against the black water, looking up at the sliver of sky far above. It felt like entering a cathedral or a tomb. They were searching for the Shoshone people. They needed horses. Without horses, they could not cross the mountains that loomed ahead, mountains that were piling up on the horizon, range after range, white with snow even in July. They saw smoke signals in the distance. The Shoshone knew they were there, but the Indians remained elusive, fearing that this group of armed men were allies of their enemies, the Blackfeet or the Sioux. The expedition was moving blindly, chasing a ghost, dragging their boats deeper into the high country, with winter already whispering in the night winds. By late July 1805, the Missouri River, once a mighty flood that could swallow whole trees, had become a labyrinth of shallow channels and frustrating dead ends. The expedition was now deep in the grasp of the mountains. The landscape had shifted from the surreal sandstone architecture of the breaks to a more rugged, alpine reality. The air was thin and crisp, smelling of pine resin and sagebrush. The men were dragging the canoes more often than they were rowing them. The riverbed was paved with smooth, round stones that were slick with algae, making every step a treacherous gamble. Men would slip, falling into the icy water, bruising shins and twisting ankles, only to haul themselves up and lean back into the tow ropes. Their moccasins were rotting off their feet from the constant immersion. They were sewing new ones every night by the light of the fire, using raw buffalo hide that dried hard and stiff, chafing their skin raw. They were exhausted, not just physically, but spiritually. They were chasing the source of the river, a point on a map that existed only in theory, and every bend in the river revealed not the Pacific Ocean, but yet another mountain range. On July 25th, the expedition arrived at a pivotal geographic confluence. The river split into three distinct forks, uniting to form the Missouri. Lewis, with his penchant for naming, christened them the Jefferson, the Madison, and the Gallatin, after the president and his two secretaries of state. They were standing in a broad, high valley ringed by mountains, a place of stunning beauty and immense silence. But beauty was not what they needed direction. Which of these three rivers led to the Columbia? Which one would take them to the Shoshone and the horses? Lewis and Clark scouted the area, climbing high limestone cliffs to read the landscape. They chose the westernmost fork, the Jefferson, rightly guessing that it drained the main range of the Rockies. But the Jefferson was a difficult beast. It was narrow, choked with beaver dams and willow thickets. The men had to cut their way through the brush, hacking a tunnel for the boats. The river was often barely a creek. The reality of their situation was becoming terrifyingly clear. The boats, the vehicles that had carried them from St. Louis, were becoming useless. They were running out of water. Lewis knew that the fate of the expedition now hung on a single variable: horses. Without horses, they could not carry their tons of gear over the mountains that loomed to the west. And to get horses, they needed to find the Shoshone. The irony was painful. They were surrounded by signs of the Shoshone: old campfires, tracks, peeled trees, but the people themselves were ghosts. The Shoshone, living in constant fear of the well-armed Blackfeet and Atsini warriors who raided them from the plains, were masters of evasion. To them, the expedition was just another war party, strange and loud, to be avoided at all costs. Lewis decided that he could no longer wait for the boats to catch up. On August 1st, he took 3 men, George Drouillard, the master hunter and sign-talker, and Privates Shields and McNeil, and set out on foot, vowing not to return until he found the Indians and the horses. He was walking ahead of the main party, acting as the tip of the spear. For days, Lewis and his small team scoured the valleys. They walked over ground that was thick with prickly pear cactus, the spines piercing their elk-skin soles. They scanned the horizon with their telescopes until their eyes watered. They saw nothing but empty land. The pressure on Lewis was immense. He knew that if he failed, the expedition would likely perish in the mountains when the snows came, or be forced to turn back in failure, a thought that was intolerable to him. On August 11th, Lewis spotted a lone Indian on horseback a mile away. He was ecstatic. He ordered his men to stay back and walked forward alone, waving a blanket in a specific way, 3 times, which was the universal sign of friendship on the plains. He shouted "Tababone," which he believed meant white man in Shoshone. The Indian watched him, wary. Lewis rolled up his sleeve to show his white skin, which was actually tanned as dark as leather by the sun. The Indian, seeing the other men creeping up in the distance, suspected a trap. He wheeled his horse and vanished into the willows. Lewis was devastated. He blamed his men for not staying back, but the opportunity was gone. Undeterred, Lewis pressed on. The next day, August 12, 1805, marked one of the supreme moments of American exploration. The party followed an Indian trail up a gentle slope toward a ridge. As they climbed, the stream beside them, the mighty Missouri River, dwindled. It became a creek, then a brook, then a trickle. Finally, high up in the pass, Lewis found a small icy spring bubbling from the rocks. He knelt down and drank. In his journal, he recorded that he had tasted the waters of the most distant fountain of the waters of the mighty Missouri. One of his men, Private McNeil, famously straddled the little stream, thanking God that he had lived to see the day when he could stand with 1 foot on one side of the river and 1 foot on the other. They were standing on the Continental Divide. This was Lemhi Pass, the spine of the continent. Lewis expected that when he crested the ridge, he would look down and see the headwaters of the Columbia River flowing through a wide, flat plain toward the Pacific, perhaps only a few days' march away. This was the geography of hope that Jefferson had instilled in him. He walked to the top of the ridge and looked west. What he saw shattered the dream of the Northwest Passage forever. There was no plain. There was no easy river. Instead, stretching out to the horizon, range after jagged range, were immense mountains of high snow. It was a sea of peaks, a chaotic, frozen wilderness that seemed to go on forever. It was a crushing visual blow. The map in his head was wrong. The continent was far wider and far rougher than anyone had imagined. But Lewis didn't stop. He couldn't. He descended the western side of the pass, entering the Pacific drainage. The geography defeated the theory, but the mission remained.
2 days later, the breakthrough happened. Lewis and his men surprised 2 Shoshone women and a girl who were digging roots. The women, seeing the strange men appear out of nowhere, sat down and bowed their heads, expecting to be killed. Lewis, thinking quickly, put down his rifle and walked up to them. He took the elderly woman's hand and painted her cheeks with vermilion, a red pigment that was a sign of peace. He gave them beads. The women, realizing they were not about to be scalped, relaxed. They led Lewis toward their village. Suddenly, 60 warriors on horseback, armed with bows and lances, came thundering down the hill. They were led by a chief named Sacagawea. The women ran forward, showing off the beads and the vermilion paint, shouting that these were not Blackfeet, but strange white men. The tension broke. Sacagawea embraced Lewis, pressing his cheek against Lewis's and saying, "Ah," a gesture of intense relief and welcome. The Shoshone, who had never seen a white man, examined them with awe. They were fascinated by the men's appearance, their guns, and most of all, the strange pale dog, Seaman. Lewis was now a guest of the Shoshone, but he was in a delicate position. He needed horses, and he needed them to go back over the pass to pick up Clark and the boats. But the Shoshone were hungry. They were preparing to leave the mountains to hunt buffalo on the plains. They had no interest in going back into the mountains where there was no game. Lewis had to use all his diplomatic skill. He told Sacagawea that he had a larger party waiting with trade goods, guns, knives, and ammunition that would make the Shoshone powerful against their enemies. This was the key. The Shoshone were desperate for firearms to defend themselves against the Blackfeet, who had obtained guns from Canadian traders. The promise of weapons convinced Sacagawea. But the chief was suspicious. He worried that Lewis was leading them into a trap, that the larger party was actually a Blackfoot war party lying in wait. The return journey to the Forks was tense. The Shoshone warriors rode with Lewis, but they were jumpy. At one point, Lewis was forced to give his rifle to the chief and wear a Shoshone headdress, essentially offering himself as a hostage. "If I am lying, you can kill me." When they finally reached the meeting point, Clark was not there yet. The boats were slow. The Shoshone became agitated. They threatened to leave. Lewis was sweating. He sent Drouillard down the river to find Clark. Finally, the next morning, the canoes appeared around the bend. The Shoshone saw them. But the true miracle was yet to come. As the boats landed, Sacagawea, who was walking on the shore, began to dance. She struck her fingers together, a sign of recognition. She saw people she knew. She had been kidnapped from this very tribe 5 years earlier. A woman from the crowd ran out. It was Jumping Fish, a childhood friend who had been captured with her, but had escaped. They embraced, weeping. Then a council was held. Sacagawea was called in to interpret. She sat down, ready to translate the captain's words to the chief. She looked at Kameawait. Her voice faltered. She stared at him. Then she jumped up, ran to him, and threw her blanket over his head, embracing him and weeping uncontrollably. Kameawait was her brother. The chief of the Shoshone was the brother of the lost girl who had returned from the dead with these strange white men. The emotional magnitude of this coincidence is hard to overstate. It was one of those moments where history reads like a contrived novel. The reunion cemented the alliance. Kameawait promised the horses. He promised guides. The expedition was saved by the bonds of family. But the relief was short-lived. The Shoshone, while friendly, were poor. They had horses, yes, but they had little food. They were starving themselves, subsisting on roots and a few berries. The old Toby, a guide provided by Kameawait, told the captains about the route ahead. He described a river to the north, the Salmon River, that was impassable, foaming with rapids and boxed in by sheer cliffs, the river of no return. He said the only way to the big water was a trail that went over the bitterest, highest mountains, a trail that was rough and lacked game. It was late August. The snow was already dusting the peaks. The captains had to trade for horses quickly. They bought about 29 horses, mostly sore-backed and poor, paying with uniforms, knives, and a pistol. They packed their goods onto the animals, cached their canoes by sinking them in the river with rocks, hoping to retrieve them on the return journey, and turned their faces toward the Bitterroot Mountains. The crossing of the Bitterroots in September 1805 was the closest the Corps of Discovery came to death. It was an ordeal of pure suffering. The trail, the Lolo Trail, was a narrow, winding path that clung to the sides of steep ridges. It was clogged with fallen timber. The horses slipped and fell, sometimes tumbling hundreds of feet down the slopes, smashing the crates on their backs. It began to snow. It snowed for days. The trail disappeared under the white blanket. They were cold, wet, and critically, they were starving. There was no game in these high mountains, no deer, no elk. They killed a colt to eat, then another. They ate their candles. They ate the portable soup, which by now tasted like rancid glue. The men were dysenteric and weak. Lewis wrote that there was nothing but hunger and fatigue. The horses were starving too, trying to eat the bark off the trees. The psychological toll was heavy. They were lost in a white void, guided only by old Toby, who sometimes seemed unsure of the way himself.
If they had been delayed by just a few days, they would have been trapped by the deep snows and would have perished, their bodies likely never found until the next summer. But they kept moving, driven by a desperate momentum. Clark, the stronger walker, went ahead with a small party to find food. On September 20, he broke out of the timber and looked down. Below him lay a vast, open prairie, the Whiteby Prairie. It was warm, it was green, and there were lodges. He had found the Nez Perce people. The Nez Perce were a powerful nation, breeders of the magnificent Appaloosa horses. They watched the ragged, starving scarecrows stumble out of the mountains with a mixture of pity and calculation. According to Nez Perce oral history, a woman named Watgowis, who had once lived among white traders in Canada and had been treated kindly, told the chiefs, "Do these men no harm. They are the children of the Great Spirit." Her words likely saved them, for the Nez Perce could have easily killed the weakened explorers and taken their rich supply of rifles and goods. Instead, they fed them. They gave them roots, camas roots, and dried salmon. The hungry men gorged themselves on this new food. The sudden shift from starvation to a diet of heavy roots and fish caused violent illness. For weeks, the entire expedition was laid low with severe gastrointestinal distress. Men were groaning in the grass, too weak to stand. Lewis was barely conscious for days. While the men recovered, they began to prepare for the final push. They were now on the western side of the divide. The water here flowed to the Pacific. They were at the Clearwater River. They didn't need horses anymore. They needed boats, but there were no suitable trees for bark canoes. Adopting the Nez Perce method, they used the ponderosa pine logs, burning out the centers with fire and chipping away the char with adzes to create 5 heavy, clumsy dugout canoes. They branded their horses and left them in the care of the Nez Perce, trusting that they would be there when they returned. On October 7, 1805, the Corps of Discovery, sick but hopeful, pushed their new boats into the Clearwater River. The current was swift. It grabbed them and pulled them west. They were riding the water now, speeding toward the ocean. The journey down the Clearwater and the Snake River was a blur of rapids. These were not the slow, muddy waters of the Missouri. These were fast, green mountain rivers. They shot rapids that terrified the non-swimmers. The canoes took on water. They split on rocks. But the speed was exhilarating. They were covering 30, 40, sometimes 50 miles a day. The landscape changed from the pine forests to the stark basalt canyons of the Columbia Plateau. It was a treeless, desolate land of rock and sage, hot during the day and cold at night. They passed great fisheries where thousands of Indians gathered to harvest the salmon that were running upriver. The river was thick with fish, dead and dying after spawning, and the smell of rotting fish permeated the air. The tribes here, the Wanapunam, the Yakama, the Walla Walla, were different from the Plains tribes. They lived in mat lodges, flattened their foreheads as infants for beauty, and their lives revolved entirely around the river and the salmon. On October 16th, they reached the confluence of the Snake and the Columbia rivers. They were now on the great river of the West. The Columbia was massive, a mile wide in places, a powerful, surging force. They saw Mount Hood in the distance, a white cone floating in the sky, and they knew they were getting close. Captain Vancouver had described this mountain from the coast. They were connecting the map. But the Columbia had a final test for them. The river was forced through narrow chutes of volcanic rock, the Celilo Falls and the Dalles. The water was compressed into violent, boiling channels. The local Indians gathered on the cliffs to watch the crazy white men attempt to run these rapids in their heavy dugouts. To the astonishment of the observers, they made it through, bobbing like corks in the churning water. As they descended the Columbia, the climate began to shift again. The dry air of the interior gave way to moisture. Fog hung over the river in the mornings. Moss grew on the trees. They were entering the coastal temperate rainforest. And then, on November 7th, 1805, a day that lives in the memory of the expedition, the fog lifted. They were in the wide estuary of the river. The water rose and fell with the tide. Clark, in a burst of premature enthusiasm, scrawled in his journal, "Ocean in view. Oh, the joy!" In reality, they were still miles from the open ocean, and the joy would soon turn to misery. They were trapped in the estuary by fierce winter storms that rolled in from the Pacific. The waves were high enough to swamp the canoes. The rain was relentless, a cold, driving, horizontal rain that soaked through leather and wool and never stopped. They were pinned on a narrow, rocky shoreline, huddled under wet blankets, eating dried fish and rotting pounded salmon. The wind blew trees down around them. Their clothes rotted off their backs. They were so close, yet they couldn't reach the sea. For weeks they endured this purgatory of wind and water. Finally, the weather broke enough for them to cross the river and establish a camp on the south side, near the mouth of the Columbia River, in present-day Oregon. They had made it. They had walked across the continent. But there were no ships waiting for them, no comfortable ride home. They were thousands of miles from civilization. Winter was beginning, and they had to survive on a coast that was as wet and gloomy as a tomb. They began to build their winter home, a small stockade of logs that they would name Fort Clatsop after the local tribe. It was December 1805. They had reached the Pacific, but the journey was only half over.
The winter of 1805-1806 at Fort Clatsop was defined not by events, but by a single, overwhelming atmospheric condition: rain. It was a relentless, soaking, spirit-crushing deluge that fell with a persistence the men had never imagined possible. In the journals, the phrase "rained all day" appears with a monotonous regularity that mirrors the weather itself. Of the 106 days the Corps of Discovery spent on the Pacific coast, it rained for all but 12 of them. The sun was a rumor. The sky was a low, gray ceiling of stratocumulus clouds that pressed down on the tops of the giant Sitka spruce and hemlock trees, trapping the expedition in a twilight of dripping water. The air was permanently saturated, a cold mist that seeped into the marrow of their bones. Everything they owned was wet. Their leather clothes, which had been their second skin for 2 years, turned into rotting, slimy pulp. When they hung them near the fire to dry, the leather would shrink and crack, becoming stiff as boards. When they wore them outside, they absorbed the rain like sponges. The bedding was damp. The food was damp. The very logs of the fort seemed to sweat. Fort Clatsop itself was a small, rude structure, roughly 50 feet square, built of unpeeled logs that were sinking slowly into the mud. It was located on the Nettoul River, now the Lewis and Clark River, a few miles inland from the ocean, sheltered slightly from the fiercest gales, but still essentially a wooden box in a swamp. Inside, the rooms were smoky. The chimneys, built of sticks and clay, drew poorly in the heavy air, filling the small quarters with eye-stinging, acrid smoke that was barely preferable to the cold rain outside. But the smoke could not keep out the fleas. The fleas were a plague. The local Clatsop and Chinook peoples, who visited the fort often to trade, brought them, and the dirt floors of the fort became a breeding ground. Lewis wrote that he could not sleep for the torment of the insects, which swarmed in the bedding and bit the men mercilessly. To escape them, the men would strip naked and shake their blankets over the fire, hearing the tiny pops of the fleas bursting in the heat, a nightly ritual of extermination that did little to stem the tide. Hunger, the old companion of the expedition, returned in a new and frustrating form. They were surrounded by biomass. The ocean was teeming with life. The forests were green, but they were starving for fat and carbohydrates. Their diet consisted almost exclusively of elk meat. The hunters, led by Drouillard, worked tirelessly, slogging through the marshes to track the Roosevelt elk. They killed over 130 elk that winter, but the meat was lean, and without fat, it provided little sustenance against the cold. Worse, in the humidity, the meat spoiled within 24 hours. They had to smoke it constantly, turning it into a dry, tasteless jerky that gave little satisfaction. They craved salt. Their supply from St. Louis was long gone. In a desperate bid for flavor and preservation, they sent a detachment of men to the ocean shore near present-day Seaside, Oregon, to boil seawater. These salt makers kept fires burning 24 hours a day under 5 large kettles, boiling down hundreds of gallons of ocean water to scrape out the white crystals. It was tedious, back-breaking work, but when they returned with a few bushels of salt, it was received like gold bullion. The social atmosphere of the coast was markedly different from the plains. The Clatsop and Chinook peoples were not like the Sioux or the Mandan. They were wealthy, sophisticated traders who had been dealing with British and American ships for decades. They were not awed by the white men. In fact, they were often dismissive. They had seen ships larger than the fort, they had guns that were sometimes better than the expedition's worn-out muskets, and they knew the value of $1, or rather, the value of a blue bead. The chief's beads, the specific blue glass beads that Lewis had brought as high currency items, were the only things the coastal tribes wanted, and the expedition was running out. When they tried to trade for otter skins or food, the Chinooks demanded exorbitant prices. It was a cold, hard marketplace. There was little of the ceremonial gift-giving of the interior. Here, everything had a price. There was, however, one moment of excitement that broke the monotony. News arrived that a whale had washed ashore miles to the south. The blubber of a whale was a treasure trove of calories, luscious food, as Lewis called it. A party was organized to go harvest the blubber. Sacagawea, who had been cooped up in the fort with her toddler, insisted on going. In a rare recording of her voice in the journals, Clark noted that she observed that she had traveled a long way to see the great waters, and now that a monstrous fish was also to be seen, she thought it very hard that she could not be permitted to see either. She won the argument. She and Charbonneau joined the group, hiking over the steep headlands of Tillamook Head, looking down at the crashing surf to see the skeleton of the whale. The locals had already stripped most of the meat. They managed to trade for some of the blubber and oil, which the men ate with a voraciousness of addicts. As March 2006 arrived, the elk herds began to migrate away from the coast, moving into the mountains. The hunters were returning empty-handed. The men were restless. They were sick of the rain, sick of the fleas, and sick of the elk jerky. They looked at the mountains to the east, still covered in snow, and knew they couldn't cross them yet, but they couldn't stay at Fort Clatsop either. They decided to leave. They gifted the fort and its furniture to Comawool, the Clatsop chief who had been their most reliable neighbor, a final act of goodwill. On March 23, 1806, under a gray sky that threatened yet more rain, the Corps of Discovery launched their canoes into the Columbia River. They were going home. But going home was harder than leaving. On the way down, the current had been their friend, sweeping them toward the ocean. Now they were fighting the full force of the Columbia River's spring runoff. The river was rising, swelling with meltwater. They had to row, pole, and drag the heavy dugout canoes upstream against a current that was relentless. They made slow progress. The dampness continued to plague them. They were still wearing their rotting leather clothes. The psychological state of the men was fragile. They were tired, they were poor, and they were entering the territory of the river tribes who had been less than friendly on the way down.
At the Dalles and the Cascades, the great choke points of the Columbia, where the river roared through narrow basalt chutes, the tension peaked. The local tribes here controlled the portages. They demanded tribute. They stole axes, knives, and even tried to steal a dog. Lewis, his patience eroded by the long winter and the constant thievery, became aggressive. He threatened to shoot anyone who touched their property. At one point, when some Indians threw stones at his men, Lewis ordered his soldiers to fix bayonets and prepare to attack. It was a hair-trigger situation. The sleep story here is one of frayed nerves, of men sleeping with one eye open, listening to the roar of the rapids and the footsteps of potential thieves in the dark. The diplomacy of the outward journey had been replaced by the desperate pragmatism of the return. They just wanted to get through. They realized that the canoes were becoming a liability. The river was too strong, and the portages were too difficult. They needed horses. They needed to switch from a river expedition back to a land expedition. They began to trade for horses with the tribes along the river, but the price of horseflesh was high. They were selling the buttons off their coats, their empty medicine boxes, even the empty canisters that had held gunpowder. They were stripping themselves of everything they owned to buy the animals that would carry them home. By late April, they had left the Columbia River behind and were moving overland toward the lands of the Nez Perce. They arrived at the confluence of the Snake and Clearwater rivers, ragged and exhausted. But here they found a welcome that soothed their spirits. The Nez Perce, particularly Chief Twisted Hair, greeted them warmly. However, there was a problem. The mountains, the terrible bitter roots that had nearly killed them the previous autumn, were still buried in snow. It was May, but in the high country it was still deep winter. The guides told them it would be impossible to cross until the snows were no higher than the belly of a horse, which meant June or maybe July. They were forced to wait. They established a camp on the Clearwater River, which they called Camp Chapunish, a variation of the Nez Perce name for themselves. This period of waiting, from May to late June 1806, was a strange interlude. It was a time of relative leisure compared to the brutal labor of the river. The men played games, prisoners' base, and foot races, often competing against the Nez Perce, who were formidable athletes. The Americans were stronger at wrestling, but the Nez Perce usually won the races. The cultural exchange deepened. It was during this time that William Clark became, surprisingly, the most famous doctor in the Pacific Northwest. The Nez Perce suffered from chronic eye infections, likely from the smoky lodges and the blowing sand, and rheumatism. Clark, with his limited medical knowledge but a large supply of simple remedies like eye water, a solution of zinc and lead salts, and camphor, set up a daily clinic. He treated dozens of patients every morning. In exchange, the Nez Perce paid him with food, roots, dogs, and horses. The doctoring became the primary source of income for the expedition. It kept them fed. It is a curious image, the rugged explorer acting as a gentle healer, dabbing ointment into the eyes of fierce warriors and old women, bridging the gap between cultures with a little bit of science and a lot of placebo effect. But the waiting was hard on Lewis. He was anxious. He stared at the mountains every day, watching the snow line. He was a man obsessed with time. On June 10th, against the advice of the Nez Perce guides who said it was too early, Lewis ordered the expedition to pack up. They had about 65 horses now, a massive herd. They rode up into the foothills. The ground was covered in spring flowers, but as they climbed, the mud turned to slush, and the slush turned to hard-packed snow. Soon the snow was 8 to 10 feet deep. The trail was completely obliterated. They were wandering in a white wilderness, risking getting lost and dying of exposure. The horses were slipping. The trees were buried so deep they could touch the middle branches. For the first time in the entire expedition, Lewis and Clark made the decision to retreat. They turned around. It was a crushing psychological blow to turn their backs on home, but it was the only rational choice. They rode back down out of the snow, cached their baggage, and returned to the waiting game. Lewis wrote in his journal that it was the most unpleasant moment of the entire journey. To be stopped by the silent, frozen indifference of the mountains was humbling. They waited another 2 weeks. They hired new guides, 3 young Nez Perce men who knew the high trails intimately. On June 24, they tried again. This time, the snow had melted just enough. The snow was still 7 feet deep, but it was hard-packed, allowing the horses to walk on top of it. The guides were miraculous. In a landscape where every tree looked the same and the ground was a featureless sheet of white, the Indians followed the trail with an instinct that baffled the Americans. They navigated by the growth of the moss on the trees and the subtle layout of the ridges. They moved fast. They covered in 6 days what had taken them weeks of starvation to cross the previous year. On June 29th, they descended from the snowy heights to the warmth of the Lolo hot springs. They bathed in the steaming water, washing away the sweat and fear of the mountains. They had survived the barrier. They were back on the Missouri side of the divide. Now the expedition made a fateful decision. They were at a place called Travelers' Rest. They decided to split up. It was a calculated risk. To maximize their exploration, they would divide into 2 main groups. Lewis would take a small party and ride north to explore the Marias River, the tributary that had confused them on the way out. He wanted to see if it reached up into Canada, which would extend the American claim to the Northern Territory. Clark would take the rest of the party, including Sacagawea and York, and go south to the Yellowstone River, exploring that major waterway. They would meet at the confluence of the Yellowstone and the Missouri weeks later. It was a bold plan. It meant dividing their strength in hostile territory. The Blackfeet controlled the Marias River country, and the Crows were known to be master horse thieves along the Yellowstone. But they were confident veterans now. They were the men of the Corps, survivors of the impossible. On July 3, 1806, they shook hands and parted ways. Lewis rode north with 9 men. Clark rode south with the rest. Lewis's journey to the Marias would lead to the only violent combat of the entire expedition. He was riding into the heart of the Blackfoot Empire, a place where the American flag held no sway and where the white bear was not the only apex predator. The landscape was vast, open, and dangerously exposed. As Lewis and his small band rode across the high prairie, watching the horizon for the silhouette of riders, the sky darkened with summer storms, a foreshadowing of the violence to come. The separation of the captains at Travelers' Rest marked a shift in the tone of the expedition. For 2 years, the combined strength of the Corps had been its insulation against disaster. Now, fractured into smaller groups, they were more vulnerable, and the vastness of the Montana Territory seemed to expand to swallow them. Meriwether Lewis, riding north toward the Marias River with only 3 men, George Drouillard and the Field brothers, Joseph and Reuben, was entering a landscape of haunting emptiness. This was the hereditary hunting ground of the Blackfeet Confederacy, the Minnetarees of Fort de Prairie, as Lewis called them. The Blackfeet were the Spartans of the High Plains, a warrior culture that controlled the flow of guns from the British traders in the north and ruthlessly protected their territory against American encroachment. Lewis knew this. He rode with a heightened state of alertness, his telescope constantly scanning the broken horizon of the Sweetgrass Hills. The mission to the Marias was born of geopolitical desperation. Lewis needed to prove that the river's headwaters stretched far to the north, above the 49th parallel, which would give the United States a claim to a massive swath of fur-rich territory. For days, they rode through a landscape that was both beautiful and hostile. The buffalo were everywhere, dark shapes moving like cloud shadows across the golden grass, but the weather was miserable. Cold rain and hail battered them, soaking their buckskins and chilling their spirits. When they finally reached the furthest point of the river on July 22, 1806, Lewis's heart sank. The river bent west toward the mountains, not north. It did not reach the desired latitude. He named their muddy, miserable campsite Camp Disappointment. It was a rare moment of admitted defeat in his journal. They stayed there for a few days, trying to take celestial observations between the clouds, but the gray sky refused to cooperate. With low provisions and the weather turning, they decided to retreat back to the Missouri. On the morning of July 26, 1806, the inevitable happened. Lewis and his 3 men were riding along the Two Medicine River when they spotted a group of horses and men on a bluff about a mile away. Lewis lowered his telescope. There were 8 of them, young men, warriors. They were Piegan Blackfeet. To run would be to show weakness and likely futile given the Blackfeet's superior horses. Lewis made the decision to approach. He unfurled his flag. The meeting was tense but ritualized. They dismounted and shook hands. Lewis gave gifts, a medal, a flag, a handkerchief. The Blackfeet were wary, their eyes darting to the Americans' rifles. These were the first repeating firearms they had ever seen, or at least the first of such quality. The 2 groups decided to camp together that night in the river bottom, a decision that, in hindsight, was fraught with danger. As evening fell, they sat around a shared fire. Through Drouillard's sign language, they talked. Lewis told them about the peace he had forged with the Nez Perce and the Shoshone, and how the Americans would bring guns to those tribes. This was exactly what the Blackfeet did not want to hear. Their power relied on their enemies being unarmed. The Blackfeet listened in silence, their faces illuminated by the flickering firelight. Lewis, sensing the danger, took the first watch. He stayed awake until 11:30, then woke Reuben Field to take over. "Watch the horses," Lewis warned, "and watch the guns." At first light, the world exploded. It was a scene of confused violence that lasted only seconds but felt like hours. The Blackfeet had waited for the moment of deepest sleep. They grabbed the rifles of the sleeping men. Reuben Field shouted. He and his brother chased the Indians who had taken their guns. In the struggle, Reuben drew his knife and stabbed one of the warriors in the chest. The man fell dead, the first Native American killed by the U.S. government in the West. In the meantime, Lewis woke to the sound of shouting. He drew his pistol. He saw a warrior running off with his horse. He raised his rifle and fired. The ball struck the warrior in the belly. The man dropped to his knees, raised himself on his elbow, and fired back, the ball whistling past Lewis's head, barely missing him. The remaining Blackfeet, seeing 2 of their number down and the Americans rallying, scattered, driving the horses behind them. The aftermath was a scene of adrenaline and terror. They were 4 men, alone, hundreds of miles from help, having just killed 2 members of the most powerful tribe on the plains. They knew that the main Blackfoot camp was likely nearby, and that a war party of hundreds would soon be on their trail. There was only one option: ride. They didn't even stop to bury the dead warriors. Lewis took back the flag they had given them and left the peace medal around the dead man, a dark message that the Americans had been there. They saddled their horses and fled. This was the ride for their lives. They rode southeast, pushing the horses to the breaking point. They did not stop to eat. They did not stop to rest. They rode through the heat of the day, the dust coating their throats. They rode through the night, guided by the stars and the fear of what lay behind them. In 24 hours, they covered 120 miles, a staggering feat of horsemanship and endurance. Their bodies were numb, their minds hazy with fatigue, but every time they looked back, they expected to see a cloud of dust signaling the pursuit. Miraculously, on July 28, 1806, they heard the sound of rifle shots ahead. It wasn't the enemy. It was the rest of the expedition, coming down the Missouri River in the canoes they had recovered from the cache at the Great Falls. Lewis and his men galloped toward the river, the horses sliding down the banks. They were safe. The reunion was of hysterical relief. They had survived the encounter, but they had ignited a hostility with the Blackfeet that would last for decades, plaguing American trappers for generations. While Lewis was running for his life, William Clark was engaged in a very different to equally frustrating struggle to the south. Clark's party, which included Sacagawea, Charbonneau, York, and the rest of the men, had returned to the cache where they had left the canoes the year before, but they needed to cross over to the Yellowstone River. Sacagawea proved her immense value here. She recognized the landscape perfectly. She pointed out a gap in the mountains, now known as Bozeman Pass, and told Clark it was the best route to the river. She was right. It was a gentle, easy crossing that saved them days of travel. Clark noted her contribution with respect, one of the few times a woman's geographical knowledge was officially recorded in the annals of exploration.
When they reached the Yellowstone River, they faced a new problem. They had no boats. The timber here was scarce and small, and they had a silent enemy. The Crow Indians, Apsalaok, were watching them. The Crow were the premier horse thieves of the plains, masters of stealth, who could walk into a camp and steal a horse from under a sleeping man's nose without waking him. Clark never saw a single Crow Indian. He only saw their footprints, and he saw his horses disappearing. One morning, 24 horses were gone. A few days later, the rest vanished. The expedition was unhorsed. They were stranded on the banks of the Yellowstone with piles of baggage and no way to move. Clark, the pragmatist, did not panic. He ordered the men to search for any timber suitable for canoes. They found 2 small, stunted cottonwood trees. They were too small to make stable canoes, so Clark improvised. He lashed the 2 small dugouts together side by side with buffalo skin ropes, creating a catamaran. It was ugly, but it was stable. On July 24th, they launched their strange vessel into the Yellowstone. The river was broad, braided, and beautiful, flowing through a landscape of sculpted sandstone cliffs and lush bottomlands. But the paradise had a plague: mosquitoes. The journals from this leg of the journey are almost comical in their description of the insects. The mosquitoes were so thick that the men couldn't aim their rifles. They breathed them in. The dog, Seaman, howled in misery, rolling in the mud to escape the biting clouds. Clark wrote that the face of the country was covered with herds of buffalo, elk, and wolves, but the air was solid with bugs. On July 25, 1806, Clark stopped at a massive sandstone rock formation that rose 200 feet straight out of the river bottom. It was a distinct landmark, visible for miles. Clark climbed the rock. From the top, he could see the winding ribbon of the Yellowstone and the distant herds of buffalo. In a moment of sentimental vandalism that has become a national treasure, he carved his name and the date into the soft stone. W. M. Clark, July 25, 1806. He named the rock Pompey's Tower, now Pompey's Pillar, after Sacagawea's son, the little dancing boy who had ridden on his back and charmed the expedition. It is the only physical evidence of the expedition that remains on the landscape today, a signature left in the wilderness by a man who was passing through history. Clark's party moved swiftly down the Yellowstone, the current carrying them effortlessly compared to the upstream struggle of the previous years. But the river was wild. Buffalo herds were crossing the river constantly. At one point, the canoe had to stop for an hour while a herd of thousands of buffalo swam across the river in front of them, a living dam of fur and horns. The noise was deafening. The wolves were there too, picking off the stragglers. It was a display of the sheer abundance of the American West before the era of settlement, a vision of nature operating on a scale that is now extinct. By early August, both captains were racing toward the confluence of the Missouri and the Yellowstone. They had agreed to meet there, but the mosquitoes at the meeting point were so unbearable that Clark couldn't wait. He left a note for Lewis on a stick stuck in the mud and continued downriver, hoping to find a place where the wind would blow the bugs away. Lewis, coming down the Missouri, arrived a few days later. He found the note, but Lewis was suffering. On August 11th, a hunting stop occurred that nearly killed him. Lewis was hunting elk with Pierre Crousat. Crousat was a one-eyed fiddle player whose vision was understandably poor. They spotted an elk in the willows. Lewis fired. Then he felt a massive blow to his left thigh. He collapsed. He assumed the Blackfeet had attacked him. "I am shot," he yelled, dragging himself back to the boat, calling the men to arms. But there were no Indians. It was Crousat. The one-eyed Frenchman had mistaken Lewis's buckskins for an elk and shot his captain through the buttocks. The ball passed through the flesh, missing the bone and the artery by a fraction of an inch. It was a painful, humiliating, and dangerous wound. Lewis was incapacitated, lying on his face in the bottom of the canoe, feverish and in agony as they floated down the river to catch Clark. On August 12, 1806, the two parties finally reunited on the Missouri River. It was a joyous moment, though tempered by Lewis's injury. They were together again. The core of discovery was whole. They turned their boats south and east into the main channel of the Missouri. The current was with them now. They were riding the river home. They were moving fast, covering 50, 60, sometimes 70 miles a day. The landscape began to change back to the familiar. The mountains receded. The short grass prairie gave way to the tall grass. And then they saw something they hadn't seen in 2 years. A cow, a domestic cow on the bank. It was a sign of civilization. They cheered. But before they could reach St. Louis, they had one final piece of business. They had to pass the Mandan villages again. They arrived in mid-August. The reunion with the Mandan and Hidatotsi chiefs was warm. They had to say goodbye to their fellow travelers. Toussaint Charbonneau was paid off, $500.33 for his services. Sacagawea, who had been the most critical member of the expedition in many ways, received nothing. She was merely the wife of an employee. But Clark, who had grown deeply attached to the little boy, Pomp, offered to take the child to St. Louis and educate him in St. Louis and Europe. Sacagawea and Charbonneau agreed, but said the child was too young yet to leave his mother. They would bring him down in a year or so. They did, and Clark kept his promise, educating Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau in St. Louis and Europe. As they pushed off from the Mandan villages, they left behind another member of the Corps of Discovery. John Colter, one of the best hunters, asked for permission to be discharged early. He had met 2 trappers heading back up the river, and the call of the wilderness was too strong. He wanted to go back. The captains agreed. Colter turned his canoe around and paddled back into the wilderness, where he would later become the first white man to see the geysers of Yellowstone, Colter's Hell. The rest of the men thought he was crazy. They were desperate for bread, for whiskey, for women, for beds.
The final leg of the journey was a victory lap. The river was high and fast. They met traders coming upriver who looked at them as if they were ghosts. "We were supposed to have been lost," Clark noted. The newspapers in the East had long ago speculated that they had been killed by savages or bears. Yet here they were, tanned like leather, dressed in rags, but alive. On September 23, 1806, a rainy morning, they rounded the final bend and saw the town of St. Louis. They fired their rifles in a salute. The townspeople ran to the riverbank. They saw the bearded, weathered men in the strange canoes. There was a moment of silence and then a roar of welcome. They had been gone for 2 years, 4 months, and 10 days. They had traveled over 7,000 miles. They had lost only one man. They had opened the continent. Lewis and Clark stepped off the boat and walked into the streets of St. Louis, blinking in the strange reality of civilization. The expedition was over. The physical journey had ended, but the story of what happened next, the fame, the tragedy, and the unraveling of Lewis's mind is the final haunting chapter of their lives.
The return to civilization is often more perilous than the departure from it. For the men of the Corps of Discovery, the transition from the wild, adrenaline-fueled existence of the frontier to the rigid, paved, and polite society of 1806 was a shock to the system, akin to the bends experienced by deep-sea divers rising too quickly. St. Louis, though a frontier town itself, felt suffocatingly crowded to men who had grown accustomed to a world where the nearest neighbor was a mountain range away. They had spent over 800 days sleeping on the ground, wrapped in buffalo robes, under a canopy of stars. Now they were offered feather beds that felt too soft, in rooms that felt too small, with ceilings that blocked the sky. The silence of the plains was replaced by the clatter of carriage wheels, the barking of town dogs, and the constant demanding questions of strangers. They were celebrities, the astronauts of their day, returning from the dark side of the moon, and everyone wanted a piece of them. In the days immediately following their arrival, the expedition dissolved as a military unit and began to fragment into individual stories of acclaim and disappointment. For William Clark and Meriwether Lewis, there were balls and dinners. They were toasted with fine wine, a stark contrast to the stagnant pond water they had drunk only months before. But for the enlisted men, the men of the Corps, the reward was more tangible but less glorious. They received their back pay and land grants, 320 acres of land west of the Mississippi, a fortune for a poor dirt farmer. Most of them took the land and disappeared into the anonymity of the growing nation. They became trappers, farmers, and traders. They carried the secret history of the continent in their minds, stories of grizzlies and waterfalls that they would tell to their grandchildren by firelight. Stories that would slowly turn into family legends, then myths, until they were forgotten entirely. But for one member of the expedition, the return to St. Louis was a tragedy of profound injustice. York, the enslaved man who had been Clark's childhood companion and his bodyguard on the journey, had experienced a transformation on the frontier. In the wilderness, the rigid hierarchy of race had been eroded by the necessity of survival. York had carried a gun. He had hunted for the party. He had voted on where to build the winter fort. To the Native American tribes, he was a figure of immense power and fascination, often treated with more respect than the white captains because of his unique appearance and strength. He had tasted a kind of freedom, a functional equality born of merit and sweat. When the keelboat touched the dock in St. Louis, that equality evaporated instantly. He was no longer a member of the Corps of Discovery. He was once again simply Clark's boy. York asked Clark for his freedom as a reward for his service. He wanted to remain in Louisville near his wife, who was enslaved by another family. Clark, the man who had shown such benevolence to the Nez Perce and such leadership on the river, refused. In letters to his brother, Clark expressed shock and irritation at York's insolence. He
He could not understand why York was unhappy. He threatened to whip him. He eventually hired him out to a harsh master to break his spirit. The story of York is the dark shadow cast by the shining success of the expedition, a reminder that the empire of liberty Jefferson envisioned was built on a foundation of contradiction. York would eventually die in obscurity, likely of cholera, his contributions largely erased until modern historians resurrected his memory. While the men dispersed, Lewis and Clark prepared for the victory lap, the journey to Washington City to report to the president. They did not travel alone. They brought with them a delegation of Osage and Mandan chiefs, including the Mandan chief Sacagawea, Big White, who had agreed to travel east to meet the Great Father. This journey was a slow parade of wonders. Everywhere they stopped, Louisville, Frankfort, Charlottesville, crowds gathered. They wanted to see the men who had crossed the mountains. They wanted to see the Indians. They wanted to see the Western curiosities. Lewis had brought back crates of specimens, skins of the grizzly bear, the mountain goat, and the antelope, pressed plants, cages with live animals, and the meticulous maps that Clark had drawn. They arrived in Washington in early 1807. The meeting between Thomas Jefferson and Meriwether Lewis in the President's house was the closing of the circle that had begun 3 years earlier. Jefferson, the armchair explorer who had dreamed of the West from his library, finally saw the reality of it laid out on the floor. Lewis unrolled Clark's master map. It was a masterpiece of cartography, but it delivered a hard truth. There was no Northwest Passage. The dream of a simple water route to the Orient was dead. The map showed a tangled knot of mountain ranges, hundreds of miles thick, blocking the way. The Garden of the West was not a gentle Eden. It was a rugged, formidable barrier. Jefferson, to his credit, absorbed this disappointment with the mind of a scientist. He realized that while the commercial route was not what he hoped, the scientific and territorial prize was far greater. They had unlocked a continent. Jefferson was ecstatic about the specimens. The sheer volume of new knowledge was staggering. Lewis and Clark had documented 178 plants and 122 animals previously unknown to science. They had documented the cultures of dozens of indigenous nations. They had proven that the continent was wider than anyone thought. Jefferson immediately moved to secure the rewards for his captains. He appointed William Clark as the Superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Louisiana Territory and Brigadier General of the militia. For Lewis, he had a higher honor, or perhaps a heavier burden. He appointed him Governor of the Louisiana Territory. It was here, in the marble halls of Washington and the drawing rooms of Philadelphia, that the unraveling of Meriwether Lewis began. Lewis was a man suited for the rigors of the trail, where the objectives were clear: climb that ridge, cross that river, hunt that bear. He was a man of action and brooding intensity. He was not suited for the swamp of politics. As governor, based in St. Louis, he was thrust into a world of land speculation, petty feuds, bureaucratic paperwork, and constant debt. He was a terrible politician. He lacked the soft touch. He made enemies easily. He was rigid where he needed to be flexible and absent where he needed to be present. But the seed of his destruction lay in his failure to perform the one task Jefferson wanted most: the publication of the journals. The world was waiting for the book. Publishers were lining up. Jefferson urged him to write. "The world is hungry for your story," he told him. Lewis promised to write. He announced a 3-volume masterpiece, but he never wrote a single line for publication. The journals, those magnificent leather-bound field books that he had guarded with his life in the canoe, sat in a trunk, unopened. Lewis suffered from a paralyzing writer's block. compounded by a deepening depression. The silence that had once been his refuge in the woods now became a prison in his mind. He drank heavily. He took laudanum or opium to sleep. The constitutional gloom that he had mentioned in his youth returned with a vengeance.
While Lewis struggled in the governor's mansion, the geopolitical consequences of the expedition were already rippling out across the West. The map Clark had drawn was not just a record of the past, it was a blueprint for the future. The American fur trappers, the mountain men, used it as a guide. One of the first to go back was Manuel Lisa, a Spanish-American trader who built a fort at the mouth of the Bighorn River in 1807. John Colter, the Corps member who had stayed behind, worked for him. The solitude of the mountains that Lewis and Clark had experienced was brief. Within a decade, the beaver streams they had discovered were being trapped out. The Blackfeet, whose hostility Lewis had ignited, became the scourge of the trappers, engaging in a 30-year war to protect their lands. The innocence of the first contact was gone. The era of exploitation had begun. The fate of the Mandan villages, the site of the Happy Winter of 1804, serves as a grim barometer of this change. The expedition had been the first wave of a tsunami. The traders who followed brought whiskey, guns, and microbes. In 1837, an American steamboat, the St. Peter, traveled up the Missouri to the Mandan villages. It carried passengers infected with smallpox. The disease tore through the earth lodges like a firestorm. The Mandan, who had numbered around 1,600 when Lewis and Clark feasted with them, were reduced to fewer than 150 survivors in a matter of weeks. The vibrant trade hub of the northern plains, the capital where the captains had danced and smoked the pipe, was turned into a ghost town of rotting corpses. It is a heartbreaking postscript to the expedition, a reminder that the hand of discovery often carries the germ of destruction. But back in 1808 and 1809, Meriwether Lewis was fighting his own private plague. His administration of the Louisiana Territory was in shambles. The War Department was refusing to honor the drafts, checks, he had written to pay for government business, leaving him personally liable for thousands of dollars. He was facing financial ruin and public disgrace. His enemies in St. Louis were plotting to have him removed. Desperate to clear his name and explain his accounts to the government, Lewis decided to travel to Washington, D.C. to face his accusers. He set out in September 1809. He took a boat down the Mississippi to Memphis, intending to take a ship around Florida to Washington. But on the boat, he was erratic. He was drinking hard. He attempted suicide twice, requiring his servants to restrain him. The crew, worried about his mental state, put him ashore near Memphis, then Fort Pickering. The commander of the fort, Captain Gilbert Russell, detained him for his own safety. Russell dried him out, keeping him off alcohol for a week. Lewis seemed to recover. He regained his clarity. He decided to change his route. He would travel overland along the Natchez Trace, a notorious wilderness road that ran from Mississippi to Tennessee, known for bandits and lonely stretches of forest. It was a fateful decision. On October 10, 1809, Meriwether Lewis, accompanied by his servants and a Chickasaw agent named James Neely, stopped for the night at a lonely roadside inn called Grinder's Stand, about 70 miles southwest of Nashville. The inn was a rough log cabin. Mrs. Grinder, the proprietor's wife, later testified that Lewis was behaving strangely. He paced the floor. He talked to himself. He refused a bed, preferring to sleep on the floor in his buffalo robes, a habit from the expedition that he had never shaken. The night was quiet. The servants were sleeping in the barn.
In the early hours of October 11th, shots rang out. Mrs. Grinder heard the heavy thud of a body falling. She heard Lewis crying out, "Oh, Lord!" She was too terrified to open the door. Through the chinking of the logs, she saw him staggering. He had been shot in the head and the chest. He dragged himself to her door, begging for water. She did not open it. He crawled back to his room. When the servants finally came in at dawn, they found the governor of Louisiana, the great explorer, lying on his bearskins, alive but dying. He looked at them and said, "I have done the business, my good servant." He had used his own pistols. He died a few hours later, just 35 years old. The death of Meriwether Lewis remains one of history's great mysteries. Was it suicide? Most historians, including Jefferson and Clark, believed it was. They knew his demons. They knew his family history of depression. But for years, rumors persisted that he was murdered by bandits on the trace or by a conspiracy of his political enemies. The forensic evidence was mishandled, and the truth lies buried with him under a broken column monument in the Tennessee woods, a life cut short by the weight of its own achievement. When the news reached Thomas Jefferson at Monticello, he was heartbroken. He wrote a eulogy for Lewis that stands as one of the most beautiful and tragic assessments of a man's life. He described Lewis's courage as undaunted, his firmness equal to every exigency, but he also acknowledged the hypochondriac affections that had plagued him. Jefferson, who had sent him west to find the future, had ultimately watched the journey destroy him. William Clark, the steady, reliable co-captain, received the news with a heavy heart. I fear the weight of his mind has overcome him," he wrote. Clark would live on for another 3 decades, becoming the patriarch of the West. He became the governor of the Missouri Territory and the superintendent of Indian Affairs. He was the man everyone went to see before heading into the wilderness. He raised Sacagawea's son, Jean-Baptiste. He published the journals, finally in 1814, ensuring that the story would not die. But without Lewis, the story had lost its brilliant, tortured soul. Clark was the body of the expedition. Lewis had been its eyes. The legacy of the Lewis and Clark expedition is not just a line on a map. It is the story of the American paradox. It was a mission of science and peace that paved the way for war and conquest. It was a journey of incredible multicultural cooperation: French, Black, Shoshone, Virginian, Kentuckian, that led to an era of segregation and displacement. It was a triumph of human endurance that ended in the suicide of its leader. Yet there is something in the story that endures beyond the tragedy. It is the sheer physical reality of the land. In the journals, stripped of the politics, there remains the description of a world that was fresh and new. The way the light hit the white cliffs, the taste of the cold water at the source, the smell of the sagebrush, the sound of the wind in the grass. This boring history is a meditation on the land itself, a land that was once so vast and so unknown that a man could walk into it and disappear, or walk out of it and find that he had changed forever. As the years turned into decades, the members of the Corps of Discovery passed away one by one. Patrick Gass, the Irish carpenter who had built the forts and the canoes, outlived them all. He served in the War of 1812, lost an eye, settled down, married a woman much younger than him, had several children, and lived to be 98 years old. He died in 1970, the last living link to the journey. By the time he died, the Transcontinental Railroad had been built. The buffalo were being slaughtered by the millions from train windows. The West had been won, and in the process, the silence that Lewis and Clark had walked through was shattered forever. But the story does not end with the death of the explorers. To truly understand the scope of this history for a sleep story, one must look at the ghosts they left behind, the physical markers, and the strange, lingering echoes of their passing. The trees they blazed, the names they gave to rivers that are still used today, the Milk River, the Marias, the Jefferson, the Philanthropy River, which didn't stick, later renamed the Ruby, and the mystery of the lost artifacts. What happened to the air gun? What happened to the peace medals? In the quiet museums of America, there are small, unassuming objects that hold the vibration of the journey. A compass, a branding iron, a telescope. If you look at them long enough, you can almost hear the dip of the paddle in the water and the voice of the captains shouting, "Proceed on," the phrase that appears more than any other in their journals, a mantra of forward motion that defined not just the expedition, but the nation that sent them.
When the keel boats of the Corps of Discovery disappeared around the bend of the Missouri River in August 1806, heading back toward the comforts of St. Louis, John Colter stood on the riverbank, watching them go. He was alone, or effectively so, having turned his back on the promise of fame, pay, and soft beds to remain in the wilderness. Colter is the bridge between the age of exploration and the age of the mountain man, a figure who stepped out of the pages of a scientific journal and into the realm of myth. He was a man who had found that he could no longer breathe the air of civilization. The silence of the high plains had changed him, rewired his mind to prefer the company of the wind and the wolf to the chatter of towns. He joined two fur trappers, Forrest Hancock and Joseph Dixon, who were heading back upstream, back into the very heart of the country that Lewis and Clark had just barely survived. This decision marks the beginning of a new era in the West, a solitary, dangerous, and incredibly quiet era, where men became as wild as the animals they pursued. Colter's winters in the years following the expedition were spent in a landscape that no white man had ever seen, or at least none had lived to describe. He traveled into the region now known as Yellowstone. In the deep winter of 1807-1808, acting as an emissary for the trader Manuel Lisa to the Crow Nation, Colter strapped on snowshoes and walked 500 miles alone through a frozen hellscape. He saw things that defied explanation. He walked past bubbling mud pots that smelled of sulfur and death. He saw geysers shooting boiling water hundreds of feet into the freezing air, the steam instantly turning to diamond dust snow. He saw rivers that never froze because they were heated by the fires of the underworld. When he later returned to St. Louis and described these wonders, the exploding water, the painting pot mud, the petrified trees, no one believed him. They called it Colter's Hell, assuming it was the delirium of a man who had been alone too long. They thought he was mad, but he was simply the first witness to the geothermal majesty of the continent. But the defining moment of Colter's life, and perhaps the most famous survival story of the entire frontier era, occurred not in the magical mists of Yellowstone, but on the banks of the Jefferson River. It was the fall of 1808. Colter was trapping beaver with a man named John Potts. They were in Blackfoot country.
The Blackfeet, still simmering with rage from the encounter with Meriwether Lewis 2 years prior, were patrolling their rivers. Colter and Potts were paddling their canoes quietly, trying to stay invisible. They heard the thunder of hooves. Hundreds of Blackfoot warriors appeared on the bank, ordering them to come ashore. Colter, knowing the odds, dropped his trap into the water and paddled to the bank. Potts, panicked and foolish, stayed in his canoe. He raised his rifle and shot a warrior. He was instantly turned into a pincushion by dozens of arrows. He died in the water. Colter was now alone, surrounded by hundreds of enemies who had every reason to kill him slowly. They stripped him naked. They took his clothes, his moccasins, his gun, and his knife. He stood there, a white man in the autumn chill, waiting for the fire or the knife. But the chief decided on a different sport. He asked Colter if he was a good runner. Colter, sensing a slim chance, replied that he was a very poor runner, a slow man. It was a lie. Colter was one of the fastest runners in the expedition. The chief nodded and pointed to the open prairie. He told Colter he could go. He was giving him a head start. It was a human hunt. Colter walked out onto the prairie, about 200 yards from the line of warriors. Then he heard the war whoop. He took off. The sleep story here shifts into a rhythm of pure, desperate kinetics. Imagine the sensation of running naked across a high plains landscape covered in prickly pear cactus. The ground was hard, dry, and spiked. Every step drove thorns into the soles of his feet. The adrenaline was so potent that he likely didn't feel the pain at first. He ran with a speed that shocked the warriors. He ran for the Madison River, 6 miles away. The air was thin. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He ran until blood gushed from his nose, splattering his chest. After several miles, he looked back. Most of the pack had dropped behind, but one warrior, carrying a spear, was gaining on him. Colter was weak from the exertion. He knew he couldn't make the river before this single pursuer caught him. He made a split-second decision. He stopped. He turned around and spread his arms, shouting in defiance. The warrior, surprised by this sudden stop, and perhaps exhausted himself, tried to throw his spear, but he stumbled. The spear stuck in the ground and broke. Colter grabbed the pointed end of the broken spear, killed the warrior, and continued running. He reached the river. He didn't stop. He dove into the icy water. He knew the rest of the tribe would be there in minutes. He found a log jam, a raft of driftwood caught against an island. He dove under the water and swam up inside the log jam, finding a small pocket of air beneath the trunks of the trees. He wedged himself in there, shivering, submerged in the freezing darkness. Minutes later, the Blackfeet arrived. He could hear their moccasins on the logs above his head. He could hear them arguing, looking for him. They stayed for hours. Colter hung in the water, his body seizing with hypothermia, listening to the men who wanted to kill him, walking inches above his face. When night fell and the sounds faded, he swam out. He was naked. He had no food. He had no weapon. He was hundreds of miles from the nearest fort. His feet were shredded by cactus spines, and yet he began to walk. For 7 days, John Colter walked across the wilderness. He ate roots like the Ceralia esculenta that the Indians had taught Lewis and Clark to find. He ate bark. He survived the cold nights by burrowing into the dry pine needles. When he finally stumbled into Manuel Lisa's fort on the Bighorn River, he looked like a specter. His beard was matted, his body emaciated, his limbs scarred. The man at the fort didn't recognize him until he spoke. He had survived the impossible. Colter's Run is more than just an adventure story. It is a testament to the sheer biological will to live. It set the tone for the mountain man era that followed, a time of extreme individualism. Men like Jim Bridger, Jedediah Smith, and Hugh Glass would follow in Colter's bloody footprints. They were men who existed in a state of hyper-reality, where the margin for error was zero. They were the free trappers, beholden to no company, living by the seasons. They adopted the dress and customs of the Native Americans. They wore buckskins that were black with grease and blood. The grease made them waterproof. They married into the tribes. They spoke Shoshone, Crow, and Nez Perce. They became a hybrid culture, neither fully white nor fully Indian, living in the liminal spaces of the mountains. The economy that drove these men was based on a trivial fashion trend in London and Paris, the beaver hat. The high-crowned top hats worn by gentlemen in Europe were made of felt, and the best felt came from the soft underfur of the North American beaver. To supply this demand, the mountain men waded into the freezing streams of the Rockies every morning to set their traps. The work was brutal. The water was essentially liquid ice. They suffered from rheumatism and arthritis at young ages. They were constantly wet, and they were destroying the very ecosystem that sustained them. They trapped the beaver to the brink of extinction. In doing so, they altered the hydrology of the West. Without the beaver dams to slow the water, the wetlands dried up, the fish populations changed, and the landscape shifted. It was an ecological extraction of massive scale, carried out by lonely men in canoes. Among these men was a ghost from the past, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, the baby who had been born at Fort Mandan, who had ridden in a cradleboard on Sacagawea's back to the Pacific and back, grew up to inhabit this world with a unique grace. True to his promise, William Clark had educated him. Pompey attended schools in St. Louis, where he learned literature and history. Then, in a twist of fate, he met Prince Paul of Württemberg, a German royal touring the American frontier. The prince was fascinated by the young man and invited him to Europe. Jean-Baptiste, the child of the Shoshone and the French Canadian, spent 6 years in the courts of Europe. He learned German, Spanish, and Italian. He danced in the palaces of kings. He was a cultured gentleman who could discuss philosophy in multiple languages. But the call of the West was in his blood. He returned to America and shed his velvet coats for buckskins. He became a mountain man. He was known as the only man in the Rockies who could quote Shakespeare while skinning a buffalo. He guided the Mormon battalion during the Mexican-American War. He was a magistrate at the San Luis Rey Mission in California. His life spanned the entire arc of the 19th century West, from the dugout canoe to the gold rush. He eventually died in 1866 in a remote part of Oregon near the Owyhee River, reportedly after falling into an icy stream and contracting pneumonia. A quiet end for a man who had seen the courts of Stuttgart and the grizzly bears of the Missouri. His grave was lost for a century, a humble marker for the infant of the Corps of Discovery. As the decades of the 1820s and 1830s wore on, the rendezvous became the central social event of the mountains. Once a year, the supply caravans from St. Louis would meet the trappers at a designated spot, usually a high valley like Pierre's Hole or Green River. It was a trade fair and a debauch. For a few weeks, the solitude was broken by a carnival of noise. Thousands of Indians, trappers, and traders gathered. Whiskey flowed by the barrel. They raced horses, wrestled, gambled away a year's wages in a single night, and told tall tales. It was the Rocky Mountain College, where knowledge of the geography was shared. A trapper might draw a map in the dirt with a stick, showing a pass he had found, and that dirt map would eventually find its way to an Army topographical engineer. The mountain men were the unconscious cartographers of the nation. But by 1840, the era was ending. The beaver were gone. Silk hats had replaced beaver hats in fashion. The rendezvous system collapsed. The mountain men, those who were still alive, had to adapt. Some became guides for the wagon trains that were beginning to spill out of the Midwest. The Oregon Trail was opening up. The paths that the buffalo had made, which the Indians had followed, and which the trappers had widened, were now becoming roads for covered wagons. The transformation of the landscape was profound. The Great American Desert, as it had been called on early maps, was being rebranded. The silence that Lewis and Clark had walked through was being filled with the squeak of wagon axles. The travelers on the Oregon Trail were not explorers. They were families. They brought with them cows, pianos, mirrors, and measles. They cut down the cottonwood trees for firewood. Their livestock ate the grass that the buffalo needed. The conflict with the Plains tribes shifted from skirmishes to a desperate existential war.
One of the most poignant echoes of the frontier is the fate of the animals themselves. The buffalo, the moving black islands that Lewis had described, began to vanish. It wasn't just hunting for food, it was industrial slaughter. By the 1870s, hide hunters were killing buffalo just for the skin, leaving the meat to rot. The plains were littered with white bones. The Native Americans, who depended on the buffalo for everything, food, shelter, tools, religion, watched their world disintegrate. The extinction of the buffalo was the final nail in the coffin of the free life of the Plains Indians. It was a tragedy of biology and culture entwined. Yet, in the midst of this change, there were moments where the old mystery remained. The story of the lost trappers is one such fragment. There were men who simply walked into the mountains and never came back, leaving no trace. Did they die of cold? Did they join a tribe and forget their English? Did they find a hidden valley and decide to stay? The West is full of unmarked graves and unanswered questions. The wind in the sagebrush blows over the bones of anonymous men who sought the horizon and found eternity instead. The forts that Lewis and Clark had built, Fort Mandan, Fort Clatsop, rotted away. The rivers shifted their courses and washed the sites into the mud. For a long time, there was no physical evidence that they had ever been there, but the names remained, and the stories. The story of the bird woman, Sacagawea, began to grow. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, she was elevated into a suffragette icon, a symbol of peace and cooperation. Statues were built. The reality of her life, a kidnapped slave girl who survived by her wits and luck, was smoothed over into a romantic legend. But the truth of her resilience is far more compelling than the myth. As we move deeper into the 19th century in this narrative, the sleep story aspect comes from the repetition of the seasons. The snow falls on the Rockies, the ice breaks on the Missouri, the grass turns green, then gold, then brown, the wind blows. The history of the West is a history of weather as much as it is of people. The blizzards that trapped the Donner Party, the droughts that broke the homesteaders, the floods that swept away towns. The land was always the main character. It was indifferent to the ambitions of presidents and kings. It simply existed, vast and breathing.
The transition from the canoe to the steamboat changed the soundscape of the river. The puff, puff, puff of the steam engine replaced the splash, drip, splash of the paddle. The river became a highway of commerce, but beneath the surface, the Missouri remained the same dangerous, shifting beast that had tested the core of discovery. It still swallowed boats. It still moved sandbars overnight. The pilots of the steamboats had to learn the river by heart, just as Clark had done. They had to read the water. The knowledge of the river was a secret language passed down from the voyageurs to the pilots, a continuity of skill that linked the generations. In the next phase of our story, we will look at how the maps filled up. We will look at the scientists who followed the trappers, the botanists, the geologists, the paleontologists who came to dig up the bones of the monsters that Jefferson had only dreamed of. We will see the West not just as a place to survive, but as a place to understand.
By the 1830s, the silence of the American West was beginning to be filled not just with the crack of the rifle, but with the scratching of graphite on paper and the soft dab of a paintbrush against canvas. The era of pure survival was giving way to the era of observation. The explorers and trappers had mapped the rivers and trapped the beaver. Now came the chroniclers, the men who sensed with a deep, melancholy intuition that the world of the frontier was ephemeral, like morning fog that would burn off with the rising sun of civilization. They came not to take, but to keep. They wanted to capture the light, the faces, and the sheer scale of the wilderness before it vanished forever. This desire to archive the West produced some of the most meditative and beautiful moments in American history, moments where the frantic pace of expansion slowed down to the speed of a sketching hand. George Catlin was a lawyer from Pennsylvania who had abandoned his dry legal briefs for the romantic uncertainty of the palate. He was a man possessed by a singular, magnificent obsession. He had seen a delegation of Native Americans passing through Philadelphia, and he had been struck by their dignity and their impending doom. He resolved, as he wrote, to fly to their rescue, not of their lives or of their race, for they are doomed, but to the rescue of their looks and their modes. In 1832, Catlin traveled up the Missouri River not in a keelboat powered by sweat, but aboard the Yellowstone, the first steamboat to navigate the upper river. The sound of the frontier had changed. The rhythmic chant of the voyageurs was replaced by the huffing, rhythmic chug, chug, chug of the steam engine, a mechanical heartbeat that echoed off the canyon walls, announcing the arrival of the industrial age. Catlin's journey was a race against time, though he painted with a stillness that belied his urgency. He set up his easel in the Mandan villages, the same earth-lodged cities where Lewis and Clark had wintered. But where the captains had seen military potential, Catlin saw beauty. He painted the chiefs in their regalia, capturing the intricate beadwork, the eagle feathers, and the stoic pride in their eyes. He painted the bull dance and the buffalo hunts. He worked with a feverish intensity, often finishing a portrait in a single sitting, his brush moving rapidly to catch the shifting light. The Indians watched him with a mixture of suspicion and awe. They called him the medicine painter. Some feared that by putting their faces on canvas he was stealing their souls, or that they would die once their image was finished. Others saw it as a form of immortality. Catlin painted over 500 canvases, a visual encyclopedia of a dying world. His sleep story is one of quiet concentration,
The smell of turpentine mixing with the wood smoke of the lodge, the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light falling from the smoke hole, and the silent communion between the artist and the subject. Following in Catlin's wake came a European prince, Maximilian of Wied-Neuwied, and his young Swiss artist, Karl Bodmer. Their journey in 1833 to 1834 was a scientific expedition of the highest order. Maximilian was a naturalist, a man of precise measurements and careful notes. Bodmer was a draftsman of incredible skill. While Catlin's paintings were impressionistic and emotional, Bodmer's were hyper-realistic. He painted the landscapes of the Missouri with a clarity that looks like high-definition photography. He captured the white castles, the sandstone formations Lewis had admired, with geological precision. He painted the interiors of the lodges, detailing every tool, every robe, every hanging weapon. When we look at the West today through the lens of history, we are often looking through Bodmer's eyes. His work allows us to sleep and dream of a world that is geographically accurate. We can see the exact bend of the river, the exact texture of the buffalo grass, the exact shade of the twilight on the water. But the river that carried the painters also carried the agents of change. The 1840s brought a shift in the migration. The trickle of men became a flood of families. The Oregon fever had broken out in the East. It was a mass delusion, a mass hope, a belief that in the Oregon country the rain was gentle, the wheat grew 6 feet high, and the pigs ran around pre-cooked with forks in their backs. Thousands of farmers sold their land in Illinois, Missouri, and Kentucky, packed their lives into wagons, and headed west. This was the era of the Oregon Trail, a human migration that carved a physical scar into the earth that can still be seen from space. The experience of the Oregon Trail was, for the most part, profoundly boring. It was a test of endurance, not against adrenaline-pumping danger, but against monotony. The wagons, known as prairie schooners because their white canvas tops looked like ships sailing across the sea of grass, moved at a pace of 2 miles per hour. A man could walk faster than the wagons moved, and they did. Almost no one rode in the wagons. They were filled with food, barrels of flour, sacks of bacon, coffee, sugar. The families walked beside the oxen, day after day, week after week, month after month. The dust was the constant companion. The alkaline dust of the high plains was fine as talcum powder. It coated everything. It got into the eyes, the nose, the food. It turned the hair gray and the skin cracked. The soundscape of the trail was a low, grinding drone, the creak of the wooden wheels, shrinking in the dry air, the groan of the axles, the pop of the bullwhip, used for noise not to hit the animals, and the lowing of the cattle. At night, the wagons were circled not primarily for defense against Indians, actual attacks were rare, but to create a corral to keep the livestock from wandering off. The evenings were quiet. A fiddle might be played. A diary might be written. The women, the unsung heroes of the migration, cooked bread over fires made of buffalo chips, dried dung, because there was no wood on the plains. They washed clothes in muddy rivers. They gave birth in the wagons. They buried their children by the side of the road.
The trail was a 2,000-mile-long cemetery. Historians estimate that there is a grave every 80 yards from Missouri to Oregon. Cholera was the great killer. It struck with terrifying speed. A healthy man could wake up in the morning, feel a little queasy, and be dead by noon, dehydrated and blue. The wagon trains did not stop. They couldn't. Winter was chasing them. They dug shallow graves, wrapped the bodies in blankets. Coffins were a luxury of wood they didn't have, and drove the wagons over the fresh earth to hide the scent from the wolves. The sheer ruthlessness of the forward momentum is a hypnotic rhythm in itself. Proceed on. The mantra of Lewis and Clark had become the survival instinct of the pioneer mother. Midway through this journey, the travelers encountered the great landmarks of the migration, geological milestones that marked the progress of their slow walk. Chimney Rock, a spire of clay and volcanic ash rising nearly 300 feet from the valley floor, was visible for days before they reached it. It stood like a lighthouse in the desert. Then came Independence Rock, a massive granite dome that looked like a giant tortoise shell. This became the Great Register of the Desert. Travelers, desperate to leave a mark in the vastness, carved their names into the stone. They used axle grease to paint their names if they couldn't carve them. J. Smith, 1848. Mary Jones, 1852. Thousands of names. It was a cry for existence, a way of saying, I was here, I walked this path. Today, the wind has worn many of them away, but the rock remains, a stone hard drive of memory. As the wagons crossed the Continental Divide at South Pass, a crossing so wide and gentle that many didn't even realize they had passed the spine of the Rockies, they entered the Great Basin. This was the hard part. The water turned bad, the grass disappeared, the oxen grew thin, furniture was abandoned. The trail was lined with heirloom dressers, heavy cast-iron stoves, and books that had been carried 1,000 miles only to be left in the sagebrush because the animals could pull them no further. It was a shedding of the past. To reach the new world, they had to let go of the old. In 1843, in the midst of this migration, a ghost from the naturalist world made one final journey up the Missouri. John James Audubon, the famous birdman who had painted the birds of America, was old. He was 58, toothless, and his mind was beginning to slip. But he wanted to see the buffalo before he died. He took the steamboat Omega upriver. Audubon's journals from this trip are a mixture of wonder and horror. He saw the wolves, he saw the herds, but he was too late for the pristine wilderness. He watched sportsmen on the boat shooting buffalo for fun, leaving the carcasses to float down the river. He saw the decline. What a terrible destruction of life, he wrote. He painted the quadrupeds, the four-legged animals, but his energy was fading. He returned to St. Louis later that year, the last of the great observers to see the West before the fences went up. He died a few years later, his mind receding into a fog, perhaps filled with the wings of the birds he had immortalized. The 1840s also saw the West change from a direction to a destination. The Mormons, fleeing persecution, walked to the Great Salt Lake and built a kingdom in the desert. They irrigated the dry earth, turning the sagebrush flats into orchards. It was a biblical feat of engineering and faith. They didn't just pass through, they stayed. They planted roots. The state of Deseret was a testament to the power of organized community over the individualism of the trapper.
And then came the gold. In 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall found a few flakes of yellow metal in the tail race of a sawmill in California. The news traveled slowly at first, then with the speed of a telegraph signal. By 1849, the world tilted. The 49ers did not walk with the slow agrarian rhythm of the Oregon settlers. They ran, they rushed, they came by sea, rounding Cape Horn. They came across the Isthmus of Panama, risking yellow fever. They came across the plains, overcrowding the trail, creating traffic jams in the middle of the wilderness. It was a frenzy of greed and hope. The gold rush changed the demographic of the West instantly. It brought Chinese immigrants, Chileans, Australians, Frenchmen. San Francisco grew from a sleepy village of 200 people to a city of 36,000 in a few years. It was a city of canvas and wood, burning down and being rebuilt every few months. Ships were abandoned in the harbor, their crews deserting to the mines. The ships were eventually dragged ashore and used as buildings, their hulls becoming the foundations of the city. The West was no longer a quiet place of observation. It was a loud, chaotic, industrial machine. The rivers of the Sierra Nevada were dammed and diverted. Hydraulic cannons blasted away entire mountainsides to get at the gold, sending tons of silt downstream, burying farmlands and choking the rivers. The environmental violence was staggering, a far cry from the careful canoe paddling of the Corps of Discovery. Yet, in the high mountains, the snow still fell quietly. In the deep canyons where the gold seekers didn't go, the silence remained. The grizzly bear, now hunted relentlessly, retreated into the most inaccessible fastnesses. The wolf learned to fear the scent of man. The wilderness was shrinking, contracting like a drying hide, but it was still there. The 1850s brought the surveyors. The United States government wanted a railroad. The wagon trail was too slow. They needed iron and steam to bind the nation together. Army engineers, men trained at West Point, fanned out across the West. They were looking for the grade, the steady, gentle slope that a locomotive could climb. They climbed the passes that the mountain men had found. They measured the snow depth. They mapped the geology. They were reducing the romance of the landscape to trigonometry. They were preparing the way for the end of the frontier. The story of the West is often told as a story of movement, but for the sleep story, we must focus on the spaces between the movement. The long, hot afternoons on the high plains, where the only sound is the grasshopper. The nights on the trail, where the Milky Way looks like a spilled bucket of milk, so bright it casts a shadow. The feeling of smallness that a person feels when standing under the big sky. This feeling did not change with the arrival of the wagon or the train. The scale of the land remained the ultimate silencer of human ego. As the decade of the 1850s closed, the clouds of a different war were gathering in the East. The Civil War would draw the attention of the nation away from the frontier for a few years, but it would also sow the seeds for the final conquest. The soldiers who learned to kill on the battlefields of Shiloh and Gettysburg would eventually be sent west to deal with the Indian problem. The technology of death, the repeating rifle, the telegraph, the organized logistics of total war would be turned against the tribes. But before that final tragedy, there was a moment of pause, a breath held before the plunge. The Pony Express, which ran for only 18 months in 1860 to 1861, captures this fleeting moment perfectly. It was a system of pure kinetics, young men, orphans mostly, riding fast horses, carrying mail from Missouri to California in 10 days. It was a relay race against geography. The riders were lightweight, the saddles were thin, the letters were written on tissue paper to save weight. They rode through storms, through the night, changing horses every 10 miles at swing stations, changing riders every 75. It was the apex of flesh and blood communication, the fastest a human could move information across the earth before electricity took over. And then the telegraph wire was connected. The singing wire stretched across the plains. The first message was sent. The Pony Express stopped instantly. The riders were fired. The horses were sold. The era of the horse was beginning to yield to the era of the machine. In the next chapter of our story, we will look at the iron horse. We will see the driving of the golden spake. We will see the professional hunters who wiped out the buffalo herds to starve the tribes. But we will also see the birth of the conservation movement, the strange idea that perhaps, just perhaps, some of this wilderness should be saved. We will see the creation of Yellowstone National Park, the closing of the circle that John Colter began.
The silence of the American West, which had once been defined by the wind in the sagebrush and the howling of wolves, was irrevocably shattered on May 10, 1869. On that day, at a desolate spot in the Utah Territory called Promontory Summit, a crowd of rough men, Irish immigrants from the East, Chinese laborers from the West, politicians in silk hats, and soldiers in blue uniforms, gathered to drive a final spike into a tie of polished laurel wood. The spike was made of gold. When the maul struck it, the sound rang out not just across the desert, but across the nation via the telegraph wires attached to the sledgehammer. It was the signal that the continent had been stitched together with iron thread. The transcontinental railroad was finished. The journey that had taken the Corps of Discovery 2.5 years of agonizing labor could now be completed in a week of rattling comfort. The iron horse had arrived, breathing smoke and fire, eating distances that had once killed men. The construction of this railroad was a feat of brute force that rivaled the building of the pyramids, but it was executed with the industrial speed of the 19th century. For years, the Central Pacific had chipped away at the granite fortress of the Sierra Nevada. The Chinese workers, celestials as they were called, were lowered in baskets down sheer cliffs to drill holes in the rock, plant black powder, light the fuses, and signal to be pulled up before the explosion. Many were not pulled up in time. They died in avalanches and accidental blasts, their bodies often buried in the snow until the spring thaw. On the plains, the Union Pacific crews laid track at a frantic pace, sometimes 10 miles a day, a moving city of tents and gambling halls known as Hell on Wheels following them. They fought off Cheyenne raiding parties with rifles in one hand and shovels in the other. But when the two lines met, the frontier effectively ended. The vast spaces that had insulated the West were gone. With the railroad came the end of the buffalo. The slaughter of the American bison in the 1870s and 1880s is a chapter of history that is difficult to comprehend in its scale. It was not hunting, it was extermination. The railroad split the great herd into northern and southern groups. Then the hide hunters arrived. These were men who carried heavy, long-range rifles, the .50 caliber Sharps Big 50, and set up stands on hillsides downwind of the herd. They would shoot the lead cow, and the rest of the herd, confused, would mill around her, allowing the hunter to pick them off one by one. A single hunter could kill 100 buffalo in a day. The skinners followed, stripping the hides to be shipped east for industrial leather belts and carriage robes. The meat was left to rot. For a few years, the plains were a stinking abattoir. The air smelled of decay. Then the bones were gathered. Mountains of white skulls, stacked 20 feet high, waited at railroad sidings to be ground into fertilizer or bone china. The Native Americans watched this with a horror that transcended anger. The buffalo was their commissary, their temple, their life. When the buffalo were gone, the spine of their resistance was broken. The sleep story here becomes a somber meditation on loss. The wind blew over the empty grass where millions of hooves had once thundered, and the silence that returned was the silence of a graveyard. In this vacuum, a new figure emerged, the cowboy. The cattle drives of the post-Civil War era were the solution to a simple economic problem. Texas had too many cows, longhorns, and the North had a hunger for beef. The solution was to walk the cows north to the railheads in Kansas, Abilene, Dodge City, Wichita. The era of the cowboy was brief, lasting only about 20 years, but it created the enduring mythology of the West. The reality, however, was far less glamorous than the movies. It was dust, boredom, and low pay. A trail drive was a slow, grinding procession of animals moving at a grazing pace. The cowboys spent their days in the saddle, choking on the dust kicked up by 3,000 hooves. At night, the night herders rode slowly around the sleeping cattle, singing to them. This is one of the most practical applications of music in history. The singing wasn't for entertainment, it was a sonic fence. The low, rhythmic crooning of the cowboy masked sudden noises that might startle the herd into a stampede. A stampede at night was a terrifying event, a thunder of blind muscle and horn, tearing through the darkness, crushing anything in its path. So they sang lullabies to the beasts. The old Chisholm Trail, Get Along, Little Dogies, these were songs of work, their rhythm matching the walking gait of a horse. The cowboy slept on the ground, wrapped in a sugan or quilt, drinking coffee that was thick enough to float a horseshoe. It was a life of extreme monotony, punctuated by moments of extreme danger, crossing swollen rivers or facing down lightning storms on the open prairie.
While the cowboys were driving cattle, the U.S. Army was finishing the wars against the Plains tribes. The narrative arc that began with Lewis and Clark's handshake with the Nez Perce reached its tragic conclusion in 1877. The Nez Perce, the tribe that had saved the starving expedition in 1805, the tribe of the spotted horses, was ordered to leave their ancestral homeland in the Wallowa Valley of Oregon and move to a reservation. They refused. Led by Chief Joseph, Hin Matuya Lotkekt, they attempted a desperate flight to Canada to join the Sitting Bull's Sioux who had fled there after the Battle of Little Bighorn. The flight of the Nez Perce is an epic of tactical brilliance and human suffering. For 3 months, 750 Nez Perce men, women, and children, with 2,000 horses, outmaneuvered and fought off 2,000 U.S. soldiers across 1,170 miles of the most rugged terrain in the West. They went over the Lolo Trail, the same bitter path Lewis and Clark had crossed. They moved through the newly created Yellowstone National Park, terrifying tourists. They fought battles at Big Hole and Canyon Creek. They were trying to reach the grandmother's country, Canada, ruled by Queen Victoria. They made it to within 40 miles of the border. At the Bear Paw Mountains in Montana, in the snow, they were surrounded. The army used artillery. The Nez Perce were starving and freezing. On October 5, 1877, Chief Joseph handed his rifle to General Oliver Otis Howard and General Nelson Miles. His surrender speech was recorded and remains a haunting epitaph for the free life of the American Indian. He listed the dead. Looking Glass is dead. Tehulzot is dead. He spoke of the freezing children, and he ended with the famous line, "From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever." The people who had been the first and best friends of the Americans in the West were loaded onto trains and sent to exile in Oklahoma, far from the blue mountains and clear rivers of their home. It was the final betrayal of the handshake of 1805. But amidst the destruction, a countercurrent was beginning to form. The idea of conservation was born in the West, paradoxically, by men who had gone there to exploit it.
In 1870, an expedition led by Henry Washburn and Nathaniel Langford entered the Yellowstone region to verify the rumors of Colter's Hell and Jim Bridger's Tall Tales. They were stunned by what they found. They sat by the side of the Firehole River and watched the geysers erupt with clockwork regularity. They named one Old Faithful. As they sat around a campfire near the junction of the Firehole and Gibbon rivers, discussing how to divvy up this wonderland into private claims, charging admission for the geysers, a lawyer named Cornelius Hedges proposed a radical idea. He said that this place should not belong to any man. It should belong to the people. It should be a national park. The idea took hold. In 1872, President Ulysses S. Grant signed the Yellowstone National Park Protection Act. It was the world's first national park. The concept was revolutionary, a government setting aside a vast tract of wilderness not for timber or mining, but for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. Of course, in the early days, the protection was only on paper. Poachers still slaughtered the elk. Tourists threw logs and soap into the geysers to make them erupt. It was a lawless wonderland. Eventually, the U.S. Army had to be sent in to manage it. For 30 years, the cavalry patrolled Yellowstone. Soldiers on horseback chased poachers on skis in the winter snows. They were the first park rangers. The fort they built at Mammoth Hot Springs is still there, a reminder that the preservation of nature was once a military operation. To the south, another strange story of preservation was unfolding in the Red Rock canyons of the Colorado River. In 1869, the same year the railroad was finished, a one-armed Civil War veteran named John Wesley Powell led an expedition down the Green and Colorado rivers. Powell had lost his right arm at the Battle of Shiloh, but he possessed a fearless intellect. He and his men launched wooden boats into the great unknown. They had no maps. The river on the maps was a blank space labeled unexplored. They rode into the Grand Canyon.
The journey was a nightmare of rapids and rockfalls. They were tossed like toys in the brown, churning water. They lost boats and food. They were constantly wet. Powell, unable to swim well with one arm, strapped himself into the boat. He was a geologist, and even as they faced death daily, he read the walls of the canyon like a book of time. He saw the Vishnu schist, the basement rock of the continent, billions of years old. He realized the river had not cut through the mountains. The mountains had risen around the river, and the river had sawed its way down, inch by inch, over eons. It was a concept of deep time that made human history seem like a blink of an eye. Powell emerged from the canyon a hero, but his greatest contribution was his later report on the arid region of the United States. He tried to warn the government that the West was dry. He argued that the homestead laws, which gave a farmer 160 acres, were useless in a land with no rain. He proposed organizing the West by watersheds, not arbitrary grid lines. Congress ignored him. They wanted to believe that rain follows the plow. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s would eventually prove Powell right, but for now the settlers kept coming, breaking the sod of the high plains, planting wheat in a land of drought. By the 1880s, the Wild West was becoming a performance. William F. Cody, known as Buffalo Bill, realized that the frontier was vanishing, and therefore it could be sold. He created Buffalo Bill's Wild West, a traveling circus that reenacted the glory days. He hired real cowboys and real Indians. Sitting Bull, the great Sioux chief who had defeated Custer, toured with the show for a season. It was a surreal spectacle. The men who had fought to the death for the land were now pantomiming that fight for applause in arenas in London and New York. The Queen of England watched them. The frontier had become theater. But in the quiet corners, the land remained. The winter of 1887-1888 was the big die-up. It was a winter of biblical ferocity on the northern plains. The cattle barons had overstocked the range, greedily putting too many cows on the grass. When the blizzards came, snow piled up 10 feet deep. The temperatures dropped to 60 below zero. The cattle, trapped by barbed wire fences, froze to death by the thousands. When the spring thaw came, the cowboys found the carcasses piled against the fences. The era of the open range ended in that ice. The cattle kings were bankrupt. It was a harsh lesson in the limits of the land, a reminder that nature always holds the winning hand in the end. As the century turned, the map was filled in. There were no more blank spaces. The states were being admitted one by one: North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, 1889-1890. The political boundaries were drawn, but the ghost of the Corps of Discovery still lingered. In 1904, St. Louis held a massive World's Fair to celebrate the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase. They built palaces of plaster and hemp. They displayed the technological wonders of the new century: electricity, automobiles, moving pictures. They also brought the elderly Chief Joseph to the fair, but he was not allowed to go home to his valley. He died later that year in exile, reportedly of a broken heart. And far away, in the quiet archives of the Amerindian Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, the journals of Lewis and Clark sat on a shelf. They had been published in 1814, but the original field notebooks, the ones stained with the water of the Missouri, the ones with the sketches of the fish and the leaves, the ones written by firelight with frozen ink, were largely forgotten by the public. They were the silent witnesses. They held the true texture of the journey. They contained the groans of the men, the smell of the roast dog, the fear of the bear, and the joy of the ocean. The frontier had closed, according to the Census Bureau, in 1890. But the story doesn't end with a closing door. It ends with the land itself, which endures. The river still flows. The mountains still stand. The wind still blows through the cottonwoods. In the final part of our story, we will look at the modern echoes of this history, the rediscovery of the trail, and the final resting places of the men who walked across a continent when it was new. We will walk the trail one last time, looking at it through the lens of memory and sleep. As the 20th century dawned, the American West had been transformed from a terrifying void into a grid of fences, railroads, and wheat fields. The Great American Desert, as the early mapmakers had honestly labeled the high plains, was now being marketed as the Garden of the World. Railroad companies and land boosters sold a dangerous fiction that the climate had permanently changed, that rain follows the plow. They claimed that by breaking the ancient sod of the prairie, the settlers would release moisture into the air and summon the clouds. It was a fairy tale told to desperate farmers. And for a few wet decades in the early 1900s, it seemed to be true. The wheat grew tall, the towns boomed, the tracks of the Lewis and Clark expedition were plowed under, replaced by straight rows of grain. But the land has a long memory, and it does not forgive ignorance. In the 1930s, the cycle turned. The rain stopped. The sun beat down with the ferocity that the Corps of Discovery had endured in 1805, but this time There was no buffalo grass to hold the earth in place. The grass had been pulled up by the steel plow. The wind, the relentless architect of the plains, began to lift the soil. It started as a haze, then became a darkness at noon. The Dust Bowl was the inevitable consequence of trying to impose a humid farming culture on an arid landscape. The storms were apocalyptic. Black blizzards rolled across Kansas, Oklahoma, and the Dakotas, the very lands where Lewis had marveled at the herds of elk. The dust was so fine it seeped through the window frames and keyholes. People slept with wet towels over their faces to breathe. When they woke, the outline of their heads was silhouetted on the pillow in gray silt. The cattle suffocated, their lungs filled with mud. The static electricity was so strong that blue sparks jumped from metal fences, and shaking hands could give a painful shock. It was a decade of gritty, suffocating silence. The people packed up their Fords and fled west, a new migration of refugees moving along the same trails the pioneers had taken, heading for the same promised land of Oregon and California, which were now closing their borders to the poor. While the wind was reclaiming the plains, the government decided to conquer the river. The Missouri River, the Big Muddy that had fought Lewis and Clark for every inch of their journey, was still a wild beast. It flooded cities, it shifted channels, it was unpredictable. In the 1940s and 1950s, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the modern descendants of the very military unit Lewis and Clark had led, launched a massive assault on the river. It was called the Pick-Sloan Plan. They poured millions of tons of concrete to build a chain of massive earthen dams across the Dakotas and Montana. The result was the drowning of history. The Garrison Dam, the Ahe Dam, the Fort Peck Dam. These concrete walls stopped the flow of the Missouri and turned the churning, living river into a series of stagnant, placid lakes. The rich bottomlands, the cottonwood forests where the expedition had camped, hunted, and built their fires, disappeared under hundreds of feet of water. The sounds of the river, the crumbling banks, the hissing sandbars, the call of the sandhill cranes were silenced. The most tragic loss occurred on the Columbia River. For thousands of years, Celilo Falls had been the beating heart of the Pacific Northwest. It was a place where the mighty river was squeezed through basalt chutes, creating a roar that shook the earth. It was the oldest continuously inhabited place in North America, a fishing site where tribes gathered to net the salmon leaping up the falls. Lewis and Clark had stood there in awe, watching the great mart of trade. In 1957, the gates of the Dalles Dam were closed. Crowds of Native Americans and onlookers gathered on the cliffs to watch. As the water rose behind the dam, the roar of the falls grew quieter, then turned to a whisper, and then simply stopped. The falls were drowned. The ancient fishing platforms, the petroglyphs, the rocks where generations had stood, all of it vanished under a flat, silent sheet of water. It was a profound silencing of the indigenous world, a final erasure of the wild landscape the captains had known. Yet, as the physical traces were being buried, the story itself began to rise from the archives. The mid-20th century saw a romantic rediscovery of the Lewis and Clark expedition. As America faced the anxieties of the Cold War, it looked back to the simpler heroism of the Corps of Discovery. And interestingly, the figure that captured the public imagination most vividly was not the brooding Lewis or the steady Clark, but the young mother, Sacagawea. Her rise to icon status is a fascinating study in historical memory. During the suffragette movement of the early 1900s, women seeking the right to vote latched onto her story. They argued, if a woman could lead men across the continent, surely she can walk to a ballot box. She was reframed not just as an interpreter, but as a guide, the pilot of the expedition. Statues were erected in Portland, in Bismarck, in St. Louis. She was depicted pointing the way, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her baby on her back. Novels were written that gave her a romantic storyline, hinting at a love affair with Clark, which has no basis in history. She became a symbol of peaceful cooperation, a soft focus lens on a hard reality. By the 1960s and 70s, a new generation of historians began to dig deeper. They wanted to find the grit. They retraced the trail, not in canoes, but in station wagons. They found that despite the dams and the highways, there were still pockets of the Old West left. The white cliffs of the Missouri in Montana were largely untouched, protected by their remoteness. You could still float that section of the river and see the same sandstone citadels Lewis had described. You could still camp at the campsite of the Slaughter River and find the teepee rings of the Blackfeet. The environmental movement also claimed the story. Lewis and Clark became the first ecologists. Their meticulous notes on the plants and animals were seen as a baseline, a snapshot of the continent before the fall. Biologists used their journals to understand what had been lost. They read about the condors on the Columbia, the parakeets on the Missouri, the grizzly bears on the plains, all gone or diminished. The journals became a haunting document of abundance. One of the most poignant sleep story elements of this era is the silence of the archives. For decades, the original journals had been scattered. Some were in Philadelphia, some in Missouri, some in private hands. In 1953, a shocking discovery was made in a dusty attic in St. Paul, Minnesota. A desk that had belonged to William Clark was found to contain a secret bundle of documents. These were the field notes, the rough, day-by-day scribbles made on the boat before they were copied into the leather journals. They were written on loose scraps of paper, stained with river water, sealed with wax. They captured the raw immediacy of the trip. The discovery of these papers was like hearing the captain's voices again after 150 years. They described the mosquitoes, the want of provisions, the hard wind. They were the unpolished truth. As the bicentennial of the United States approached in 1976, and then the bicentennial of the expedition in 2003 to 2006, the trail became a pilgrimage route. The Lewis and Clark National Historic Trail was designated. Signs were put up along the highways, Lewis and Clark Trail. People began to follow the route in RVs, stopping at the interpretive centers to look at dioramas of the men pulling the boats. But the true seekers left the pavement. They hiked the Lolo Trail. The Lolo Trail remains the most atmospheric section of the entire journey. Because it is high in the Bitterroot Mountains, and because it is too rough for paved roads, it has remained largely unchanged. If you walk there today, you're walking on the same dirt, stepping over the same roots. The trees are different. Forest fires have swept through, but the shape of the land is identical. It is a place of profound quiet. The wind soughs through the lodgepole pines. The air is thin and scented with resin. At night, there are no city lights. It is one of the few places where you can sleep and feel the exact same physical sensation that the Corps felt: the hard ground, the cold air, the immense solitude. In the late 19th century, there was also a reckoning with the darker side of the legacy. The Native American perspective, long suppressed or treated as a colorful backdrop, moved to the center of the narrative. The celebration of the bicentennial was reframed by many tribes as a commemoration. For them, the arrival of Lewis and Clark marked the beginning of the end of their way of life. They hosted healing ceremonies along the trail. They reminded the tourists that when Clark wrote, "Ocean in view, oh the joy," he was standing on land that had been inhabited for 10,000 years. The story became more complex, more sorrowful, but also more honest. It became a story of two worlds colliding, not just one world expanding. As we move toward the conclusion of our narrative, we must look at the river today. The Missouri River is a cyborg, part machine, part nature. Below the dams, the water is clear and cold, not muddy and warm. The cottonwoods are dying because the floods that used to regenerate them no longer happen. But in the breaks, the coyotes still sing, the pelicans still migrate, and the moon still rises over the bluffs, casting a silver light on the water that looks for a moment exactly as it did in 1804. The boring history is found in the persistence of these elements. The concrete of the interstate cracks and has to be repaired. The towns on the plains shrink as the young people move away. The homesteads collapse into cellars filled with tumbleweeds. But the river keeps flowing. It is the constant. In the next part, we will take a final meditative journey to the graves of the men. We will visit the broken column of Lewis in Tennessee, the grave of Clark in St. Louis, and the lonely, disputed resting places of Sacagawea. We will reflect on what remains of their bodies and their dreams.
The physical journey of the Corps of Discovery ended in 1806, but the slow, silent journey of their bodies back into the earth took decades, scattering the men across the map they had drawn. To visit their graves today is to take a different kind of tour of the West, not one of rushing rivers and mountain passes, but of quiet cemeteries, lonely monuments, and wind-swept hills where the grass grows long over the bones of history. There is a deep, resonant peace in these places, a finality that serves as the closing punctuation to their lives of motion. The most famous and tragic of these resting places lies deep in the Tennessee woods along the Natchez Trace Parkway. Here, at milepost 385.9, stands the grave of Meriwether Lewis. It is a place of profound solitude. The forest here is dense, a mix of oak and hickory that filters the light into a green twilight. The sounds of the modern world are distant. Mostly, one hears the call of the wood thrush and the rustle of dry leaves. In the center of a small clearing stands a monument erected by the state of Tennessee in 1848. It is a column of limestone, broken at the top. The broken column was a popular symbol in the 19th century, representing a life cut short, a work unfinished. It is a stark, melancholy tribute to the 35-year-old governor who died of gunshot wounds in the grime of a roadside inn. Underneath the stone, the mystery of his death sleeps with him. For over 2 centuries, forensics experts, historians, and descendants have argued over the bones lying in the clay. Was it suicide, the final act of a man crushed by depression and debt? Or was it murder, a robbery gone wrong, or a political assassination? The grave has been undisturbed, despite calls to exhume the body for DNA testing. The National Park Service, guardians of the site, maintains the silence. It is better, perhaps, that we do not know.
The broken column stands as a monument not just to the man, but to the unknowable nature of the human mind. Visitors often leave coins or small stones on the base of the monument, a quiet gesture of respect for the man who walked across the continent but could not survive the return to civilization. 700 miles to the north, in the bustling city of St. Louis, lies the grave of William Clark. It is a world away from the lonely woods of Tennessee. Clark is buried in the Bellefontaine Cemetery, a grand, manicured city of the dead that houses the elite of Missouri history. His monument is not broken. It is a towering granite obelisk, 35 feet high, radiating strength and permanence. At its base, a bust of Clark looks out with a steady, confident gaze. He is surrounded by his family, his wife Julia, his children, and his descendants. Clark lived a long, full life. He died in 1838 at the age of 68, a revered patriarch. Visiting Clark's grave, you feel the weight of establishment. This was the man who built the West. He signed the treaties, he drew the maps, he governed the territory. He was the rock. Yet, even here, there is a touch of the tragic. Clark's later years were filled with the sorrow of managing the Indian removal, forcing the very tribes he had befriended, like the Osage and the Shawnee, off their lands to make way for white settlers. He did it with a heavy heart, often expressing sympathy for the poor children of the forest, but he did it nonetheless. His grave overlooks the Mississippi River, the great brown highway that brought him to the frontier, watching the barges drift by in an endless procession of commerce. But the most debated and mysterious grave of the expedition belongs to the woman, Sacagawea. History offers two endings for her, and the listener may choose which one offers the more peaceful sleep. The official historical record is brutal and short. In 1812, just 6 years after the expedition, a clerk at a fur trading post called Fort Manual, near the present-day border of South and North Dakota, wrote in his ledger, "This evening, the wife of Charbonneau, a snake squaw, died of a putrid fever. She was a good and the best woman in the fort, aged about 25 years. This entry, discovered decades later, led historians to believe she died young, likely of typhus or complications from childbirth, and was buried in an unmarked grave on the prairie, her bones lost to the wind and the wolf. However, the oral history of the Shoshone people tells a different, far more epic story. According to their traditions, the woman who died at the fort was another wife of Charbonneau. Sacagawea, they say, left her abusive husband, wandered the West for decades, lived with the Comanches, and eventually returned to her people at the Wind River Agency in Wyoming. There, she was known as Porcupine, or Lost Woman. She lived to be nearly 100 years old, dying in 1884. She told stories of the big water and the great fish, the whale, stories that only someone who had been there could know. Today, at the Wind River Reservation, there is a grave for Sacagawea, marked with a bronze statue and colorful prayer cloths tied to the trees. It is a place of reverence and wind, sitting at the foot of the snow-capped Wind River Mountains. Whether she lies there or in the Dakota mud, her spirit is woven into the landscape of the West, a ghost who walked thousands of miles and never truly stopped. And then there is the baby, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, Little Pump. His resting place is the most remote of all. After his life as a European courtier, a mountain man, and a gold miner, he was traveling from California to the gold fields of Montana in 1866. He was 61 years old. He fell ill after crossing a freezing river in southeastern Oregon. He died in a lonely stagecoach station called Inskip Station. For a century, his grave was just a pile of rocks in the high desert sagebrush, known only to a few locals. In the mid-20th century, historians confirmed his identity. Today, you can drive down a long, dusty washboard road in the middle of nowhere, near the tiny town of Danner, Oregon, and find his grave. It is fenced off, surrounded by vast open range. It is incredibly quiet. The wind whistles through the dry grass. It is a fitting end for the child of the expedition, born in a fortress of ice, died in a desert of sage, buried in the heart of the emptiness he had crossed on his mother's back. The physical objects of the expedition, the relics, have their own ghostly history. For a journey that carried tons of equipment, surprisingly little survives. The boats are gone, rotted or burned for firewood. The clothes wore out. The beads were traded away. But a few talismans remain, anchoring the story to reality. The most famous is the Lewis and Clark compass. It is a small silver-plated pocket compass held today by the Smithsonian Institution. Meriwether Lewis bought it in Philadelphia for $5. It traveled to the Pacific and back. If you look at it, you can imagine Lewis holding it in his hand on a cloudy day in the Bitterroots, desperate for a direction. The needle still points north. It is a tiny mechanical heart that guided them through the unknown. Then there is the air gun. For years, historians debated whether the air gun mentioned in the journals was a myth or a misunderstanding. It seemed impossible that they had a high-powered pneumatic rifle in 1803, but detective work revealed the truth. It was a Girandoni air rifle, an Austrian military weapon that used a compressed air reservoir to fire .46 caliber lead balls silently and rapidly. It was Lewis's shock and awe weapon. Whenever they met a new tribe, he would fire the air gun, demonstrating its invisible power. It terrified and impressed the observers, likely saving the expedition from attack by convincing the tribes that the white men had magical weaponry. The actual gun was found in a private collection in the 20th century, identified by unmatched repair details recorded in the journals. It now sits in a museum, a silent piece of steel that once held the breath of the expedition. Another survivor is a branding iron. Lewis had a custom iron made with his name, M. Lewis. He used it to brand trees and crates. This iron was found in the 1890s by a road crew near the Hood River in Oregon, rusted and discarded. It is a tangible signature, a stamp of ownership on a continent that could not truly be owned. But perhaps the most poignant artifacts are the living ones, the Lewis and Clark trees. Along the trail, there are still a few ancient ponderosa pines that bear the scars of the expedition. The Native Americans peeled the bark of these trees to get at the sweet cambium layer for food. The expedition noted this practice. Some trees still stand with these peel scars, living witnesses to the hunger of the past. And then there are the plants themselves, the Lewisia rediviva, bitterroot, the Clarkia pulchella, elkhorn clarkia, flowers named after the captains that bloom every spring. When the pink petals of the bitterroot open in the Montana valleys, it is a botanical echo of the men who first collected them and pressed them between pages of blotting paper. As the 21st century progresses, the sleep story of Lewis and Clark settles into the geology of the land. The interpretive centers built for the bicentennial are beginning to age. The concrete is weathering. The signs are fading in the sun. The history is slowly being absorbed back into the landscape. The trail is no longer a line on a map. It is a feeling. It is the feeling you get when you stand on a bluff overlooking the Missouri River at twilight, when the light turns purple and the water turns black. You can hear the slap of the beaver's tail. You can hear the wind in the cottonwoods, a sound like rushing water. In these moments, the centuries collapse. You are not 200 years away from them. You are sharing the same moment. The silence of the West is the medium through which their story travels best. It is a story that does not need shouting. It needs listening. It needs the patience of a winter at Fort Mandan, the endurance of a portage at the Great Falls, and the hope of a view of the ocean. In the final part of our story, we will let the history drift away entirely. We will focus purely on the sensory experience of the West, the sleep part of the history. We will walk the trail from St. Louis to the sea one last time, not as historians, but as ghosts, floating over the river, watching the seasons change, listening to the heartbeat of the continent, until we reach the Pacific and the final rest.
Now we close the journals. We blow out the candle in the drafting room at Monticello. We fold up the great map of the West with its ink lines of rivers and mountains and place it back in the cedar chest. The history is written. The arguments of the politicians, the gunfire of the skirmishes, and the shouts of the men hauling the keelboats have all faded into the past. What remains, and what will always remain, is the land itself. For the final leg of our journey, we do not need dates or names. We need only to listen to the breathing of the continent. Let us drift back down the river of time, back to the silence that Meriwether Lewis and William Clark walked through, a silence that is still there if you know where to listen. Let this be a journey of pure sensation, a drifting voyage from the muddy banks of the east to the salt spray of the west, a path to sleep carried by the current of the Missouri. Imagine you are standing at the confluence of the rivers near St. Louis where the journey began. It is evening. The air is heavy and warm, filled with the scent of wet clay and willow bark. The water before you is not just water, it is a moving earth, a thick brown slurry that swirls and boils with a muscular power. Listen to the sound of the Missouri. It does not ripple, it hisses. It is the sound of sand grains rubbing against sand grains, millions of tons of them being carried from the mountains to the sea. It is a low, constant friction, a white noise that blots out the world. The sun is setting behind the black wall of trees on the western bank, turning the muddy water into a ribbon of molten bronze. You step into a boat. It is not a heavy keelboat this time, but a vessel of air and imagination. You push off, the current catches you. But instead of fighting it upstream, you simply float above it, moving west, carried by the ghost of the wind. You drift up the lower river. The trees here are giants, cottonwoods and sycamores with white branches that look like bone in the twilight. They lean over the water, their roots exposed by the undercut banks, dipping into the current like old men soaking their feet. The air is thick with the sound of insects, a rhythmic, pulsing drone of cicadas and katydids that rises and falls like a breath. It is a hypnotic sound, a lullaby of the bottomlands. The fireflies begin to blink in the undergrowth,
tiny sparks of cold light mirroring the first stars appearing in the humid sky above. You are moving deeper into the green tunnel, away from the cities, away from the noise, into the heart of the humidity. As you move north and west, the air begins to change. It dries out. The humidity lifts. You are entering the Great Plains. The trees fall away, retreating to the river bottoms, leaving the hills bare and open to the sky. This is the ocean of grass. Close your eyes and imagine the sound of the wind here. It has nothing to stop it. It travels for 1,000 miles without hitting a fence or a wall. It sighs through the short grass, a soft, dry shh that sounds like the sea. The grass ripples in waves, bending and recovering in an eternal dance. The smell here is different. It is the smell of sagebrush and sun-baked earth, a sharp, clean scent that clears the mind. The horizon is a perfect circle. You are the center of the world. The sky is not just above you, it surrounds you, a vast dome of blue that turns to a deep, bruised purple as the night comes on. And the stars. Without the moisture in the air to scatter the light, the stars here are piercingly bright. The Milky Way is not a smudge, it is a distinct, granular river of light, a path of souls, as the tribes called it, stretching from one edge of the world to the other. You can feel the rotation of the earth here. You are small, but you are not lonely. You are held by the vastness. The only sound now is the distant, lonely yip of a coyote, a sound that rises, breaks, and falls into the silence, emphasizing the quiet rather than breaking it. You drift further west into the Badlands, the breaks. The river cuts through white stone now. The clefts rise up like silent cities, pale and ghostly under the moon. The water echoes against the stone walls. Lap, lap, lap. It is a rhythmic, soothing metronome. The swallows are asleep in their mud nests high on the cliffs. The great horned owl watches from a dead branch, a silhouette against the stars. The heat of the day radiates off the white rocks, wrapping you in a gentle warmth as the cool night air settles into the valleys. It is a place of absolute stillness. The geology here is ancient, laid down in layers of sediment over millions of years, a library of time that has no need for words. And then the sound of the water changes. It grows louder, a low rumble in the earth, the great falls. But in our sleep story, the falls are not an obstacle to be fought. They are a symphony. You stand in the mist, feeling the cool spray on your face. The water thunders down, white and chaotic, turning into foam that drifts downstream in great, lazy circles. The sound is white noise in its purest form, a wall of sound that blots out all thought. It creates a sanctuary of vibration. You watch the water falling, 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 never ending, a perpetual motion that tires the eyes and heavy the eyelids. The mist creates rainbows in the moonlight, spectral arches that fade and reappear. Now you rise. You leave the plains behind. The air grows cold and crisp. You smell pine resin and fir needles. You are entering the mountains, the Rockies, the gates of the mountains. The stone walls here are dark and sheer, rising thousands of feet straight up from the black water. It is a cathedral of rock. The river is deep and silent here, shadowed and cool. You drift through the portal, moving higher. The Lolo Trail awaits. The snow begins to fall. It is a soft, dry mountain snow. It falls in big flakes that settle on the pine boughs, weighing them down. The forest is muffled. Sound does not travel here. The silence of a snowy forest is the deepest silence on earth. It is a padded, insulated quiet. You walk along the ridge, your feet making no sound on the carpet of needles and snow. The air is thin and pure. Each breath feels like drinking cold water. The trees stand like sentinels, tall and straight, their tops swaying gently in the upper wind. But down here on the trail, the air is still. You find a place to rest under a great cedar tree. The ground is dry and soft. You wrap yourself in the buffalo robe of your imagination. The snow falls around you, building a wall of white, sealing you in a cocoon of safety. The cold is not biting, it is numbing, a slow slowing down of the blood, a hibernation. You cross the divide. The water now flows the other way. You are riding the western rivers. The current is swift and clear, green meltwater rushing over smooth, colorful stones. The snake, the clear water. The feeling is one of release. The gravity of the continent is pulling you west. You are descending. The air grows heavier again, but this time it is not the humidity of the summer plains. It is the moisture of the ocean.
The Columbia River widens out. The landscape turns to basalt, dark volcanic rock. Then the fog rolls in, the famous fog of the Pacific Northwest. It is a cool gray blanket that softens the edges of the world. The trees become vague shapes. The river merges with the sky. You are floating in a cloud. The sound of the world is dampened. The drip, drip, drip of condensation from the trees is the only clock ticking. The moss hangs from the branches in long green beards, drinking the mist. It is a temperate rainforest, a place of constant, gentle growth. The ferns unfurl in the shadows. The smell is of wet earth, decaying wood, and life. It is a fertile, sleepy smell. And finally, you feel the salt on your lips. The river widens until the banks disappear in the fog. The water begins to rise and fall with a slow, heaving breath. The tide. You have reached the edge, the Pacific Ocean. Stand on the black sand beach. The gray sky meets the gray water. The waves are rolling in from thousands of miles away, from Japan, from Russia, carrying the energy of the whole world and expending it here at your feet. Watch the waves. They rise up, dark and glossy, curl over, and crash into white foam. Crush. Hish. The sound is the heartbeat of the planet. It is the most rhythmic, reliable sound in the universe. It never stops. It never hurries. It just is. The expedition is over. The men have gone home. The forts have melted into the mud. The maps are drawn. But the waves remain. They were crashing here before Lewis was born. They were crashing here when he stood on the shore, and they are crashing here now. Imagine the campfire at Fort Clatsop burning low. The embers are glowing red. The rain is tapping gently on the roof, a rhythmic drumming that lulls the mind. The smoke rises up through the trees, disappearing into the mist. The men are asleep. The dogs are asleep. The forest is asleep. You are part of this landscape now. You are not a traveler anymore. You are the stillness. You are the space between the stars on the plains. You are the silence of the snow in the bitterroots. You are the fog on the river. You are the darkness at the bottom of the ocean. The journey is done. The proceed on has become a rest now. The long walk is finished. The boat has docked. The current has carried you all the way to the end. Let the sound of the ocean fill your mind. Wash in, wash out, rise, fall, sleep. The history book is closed. The land is at rest. Good night.